Henry of Monmouth entered the world on September the 16th, 1386, within the stone walls of Monmouth Castle, a fortress that commanded the confluence of the rivers Wye and Monnow in the Welsh Marches. The castle itself bore witness to centuries of Anglo-Welsh conflict, its strategic position marking it as a crucial stronghold in the ongoing struggle for control over the borderlands. The infant prince's birth occurred during one of the most politically volatile periods in English medieval history, as Richard II's increasingly autocratic rule generated mounting opposition among the nobility and commons alike. The England of Henry's infancy was a realm teetering on the edge of constitutional crisis. Richard II, crowned at the tender age of 10 in 1377, had grown into a monarch whose vision of royal prerogative clashed fundamentally with the established traditions of baronial consultation and parliamentary governance. The king's reliance on court favourites, his extravagant spending, and his apparent disdain for the military nobility who had distinguished themselves in the French wars created an atmosphere of perpetual tension. The Lords Appellant crisis of 1387 to 1388, which erupted when Henry was barely a year old, demonstrated the depth of noble discontent as 5 prominent lords, including Henry's grandfather John of Gaunt, challenged the king's authority and demanded the removal of his closest advisers. Young Henry's father, Henry Bolingbroke, occupied a precarious position within this turbulent political landscape. As the eldest son of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, Bolingbroke possessed one of the most illustrious pedigrees in the kingdom, yet his very prominence made him a potential threat to Richard II's increasingly paranoid regime. The Lancastrian inheritance encompassed vast estates across England, generating enormous wealth and commanding the loyalty of thousands of retainers. This combination of royal blood, territorial power, and military resources created an inherent tension between the Lancastrian branch of the Plantagenet dynasty and the reigning monarch. The castle environment in which Henry spent his earliest years provided an education in the realities of medieval governance and warfare. Monmouth Castle's Great Hall witnessed the daily administration of justice, the collection of revenues, and the organisation of military expeditions into Wales. The young prince would have observed the complex hierarchy of household officials, from the steward who managed the estate's finances to the marshal who oversaw the castle's defences. The constant presence of men-at-arms, the regular arrival of messengers bearing news from distant parts of the realm, and the periodic assemblies of local magnates created an atmosphere in which political and military considerations dominated daily life. Henry's formal education began under the guidance of carefully selected tutors who represented the finest scholarly traditions of late medieval England. His principal instructor in letters was likely a university-trained cleric versed in the trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, as well as the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. The curriculum emphasized Latin composition and comprehension, essential skills for a prince who would need to communicate with papal legates, foreign ambassadors, and learned counsellors throughout his reign. French remained equally important, serving as the language of diplomacy and courtly culture, while English was increasingly recognised as the vernacular of parliamentary proceedings and popular literature. Military instruction formed an equally crucial component of Henry's education. The prince learned swordsmanship from master-at-arms who had served in the French campaigns of Edward III and the Black Prince, men who understood the tactical innovations that had brought English armies victory at Crécy, Poitiers, and other celebrated engagements. The longbow, that quintessentially English weapon which had revolutionised medieval warfare, received particular attention in Henry's training. He practised not only with the bow itself, but also studied the deployment of archers in battle formations, learning how massed archery could disrupt cavalry charges and provide covering fire for advancing infantry. The chivalric ideals that permeated noble education in the 14th century profoundly influenced Henry's developing worldview. He absorbed the Romance literature of the period, including the Arthurian cycles and the chansons de geste that celebrated the deeds of Charlemagne and his paladins. These works presented warfare as a noble calling, emphasizing concepts of honour, valour, and Christian duty that would later manifest in Henry's conception of his role as a warrior king. The chivalric code demanded protection of the weak, defence of the church, and loyalty to one's lord, principles that Henry would invoke to justify his military campaigns and domestic policies. Exposure to continental military treatises further shaped Henry's understanding of warfare. Works such as Vegetius's De Re Militari provided classical precedents for military organisation and strategy, while more contemporary texts like Christine de Pizan's The Book of Deeds of Arms and of Chivalry offered practical guidance on siege warfare, logistics, and the conduct of campaigns. These readings introduced Henry to concepts of combined arms tactics, the importance of intelligence gathering, and the logistical challenges inherent in maintaining armies in hostile territory. The political crisis that would transform Henry's life began to unfold in the late 1390s, as Richard II moved decisively against his remaining opponents among the nobility. The king's increasing reliance on a small circle of favourites, his apparent intention to establish an absolute monarchy, and his vindictive pursuit of those who had opposed him during the Lords Appellant crisis, create an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty among the great magnates. Henry Bolingbroke found himself particularly vulnerable due to his father's prominent role in earlier opposition to royal policies and his own considerable territorial holdings and military resources. The confrontation between Richard II and Henry Bolingbroke reached its climax in 1398 with the famous quarrel between Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk. The dispute, which ostensibly concerned accusations of treason and financial impropriety, actually reflected deeper tensions about the direction of royal government and the security of the nobility under Richard's increasingly autocratic rule. When the two dukes agreed to settle their differences through trial by combat, Richard intervened at the last moment, banishing both men from the realm. Bolingbroke received a sentence of 10 years' exile, later reduced to 6, while Mowbray faced permanent banishment. The death of John of Gaunt in February 1399 precipitated the final crisis of Richard II's reign. Rather than allowing Henry Bolingbroke to inherit his father's vast Lancastrian estates, as established law and precedent demanded, Richard extended Bolingbroke's exile to life and declared the Duchy of Lancaster forfeit to the crown. This unprecedented violation of inheritance rights sent shockwaves through the nobility, as every great landowner recognised that their own estates might face similar confiscation if they fell from royal favour. Henry Bolingbroke's response demonstrated both political acumen and military capability. Landing at Ravenspur in Yorkshire in July 1399 while Richard campaigned in Ireland, Bolingbroke initially claimed only his rightful inheritance as Duke of Lancaster. His rapid accumulation of support, however, reflected widespread dissatisfaction with Richard's government. The Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland joined Bolingbroke's cause, bringing with them the military might of the northern marches. Cities and towns opened their gates to the returning exile, and even Richard's appointed officers began to declare for the Lancastrian claimant. For 12-year-old Henry of Monmouth, his father's dramatic return and subsequent usurpation of the throne represented a complete transformation of his prospects and responsibilities. No longer merely the son of a great duke, he now stood as heir apparent to the English crown, bearing the title Prince of Wales, that carried with it both immense privilege and equally daunting obligations. The coronation of Henry IV in October 1399 marked the beginning of the Lancastrian dynasty, but it also initiated a period of persistent challenges to the new regime's legitimacy. The Welsh rebellion, led by Owain Glyndwr, provided young Prince Henry with his first serious military experience, and would prove formative in developing his understanding of warfare, leadership, and the complexities of governing a diverse realm. Glyndwr, a Welsh nobleman with claims to the Principality of Powys, had initially sought redress through English legal channels for disputes with his English neighbours. When these efforts failed, He proclaimed himself Prince of Wales in September 1400, launching a rebellion that would consume Wales for over a decade. The Welsh uprising presented unique challenges that differed significantly from conventional medieval warfare. Glyndwr's forces employed guerrilla tactics, striking swiftly at English strongholds before melting away into the mountainous terrain that provided natural fortification. The Welsh rebels demonstrated intimate knowledge of local geography, using hidden paths and remote valleys to avoid English patrols, while launching surprise attacks on isolated garrisons and supply convoys. This style of warfare demanded different tactical responses from those employed in the set-piece battles that characterised Anglo-French conflicts. Prince Henry's initial campaigns in Wales, beginning around 1403 when he was 16 years old, exposed him to the harsh realities of counterinsurgency warfare. The English response required not only military action but also careful attention to logistics, intelligence gathering, and the maintenance of local alliances. Henry learned to coordinate operations between multiple fortified positions, ensuring that isolated garrisons received adequate supplies and reinforcements while maintaining communication across hostile territory. The siege warfare that dominated much of the Welsh conflict provided Henry with extensive experience in both offensive and defensive operations. Welsh castles like Harlech and Aberystwyth became focal points of prolonged campaigns, requiring English forces to master the complex logistics of maintaining siege lines over extended periods. Henry observed the deployment of siege engines, including trebuchets and mangonels, while also learning the importance of controlling surrounding territory to prevent relief attempts. Perhaps most significantly, the Welsh campaigns taught Henry the crucial relationship between military success and political legitimacy. Glyndwr's ability to sustain his rebellion depended not merely on military victories, but on his capacity to present himself as the legitimate ruler of Wales and to maintain the support of the Welsh population. Henry witnessed how effective governance required not just the ability to win battles, but also the skills necessary to administer territory, collect revenues, and maintain the loyalty of diverse populations with potentially conflicting interests. The young prince's growing reputation as a military commander emerged from his handling of these complex challenges. Unlike the chivalric ideals of individual combat that dominated much Romantic literature, the Welsh wars demanded systematic planning, careful resource management, and the ability to adapt tactics to local conditions. Henry demonstrated particular skill in coordinating combined operations involving infantry, cavalry, and archery units, developing the tactical flexibility that would later prove crucial in his French campaigns. The transformation of Henry of Monmouth from a battlefield commander to heir apparent brought with it a complex web of expectations, responsibilities, and temptations that would define his adolescence and early adulthood. As the Welsh campaigns continued to demand his attention through the early 1400s, the prince simultaneously navigated the treacherous waters of court politics, family dynamics, and the peculiar challenges facing the son of a usurper king. The historical record reveals a young man far more nuanced than the carousing wastrel of later literary imagination, yet one whose youth was nonetheless marked by genuine tensions with royal authority and the gradual assumption of unprecedented political influence. The legendary tales of Prince Hal's dissolute youth, immortalised in Shakespeare's Henry IV plays, have so thoroughly permeated popular consciousness that separating historical reality from dramatic fiction requires careful examination of contemporary sources. The chroniclers of Henry's era, including Thomas Walsingham, Adam of Usk, and the author of the Gesta Henrici Quinti, provide glimpses of a prince whose behaviour occasionally raised eyebrows at court, but whose reputation for debauchery appears largely exaggerated by later writers seeking dramatic effect. Walsingham, writing during Henry's lifetime, mentions instances of the prince's youthful exuberance, but focuses primarily on his military achievements and growing political acumen. The most frequently cited evidence for Henry's wild youth comes from later chroniclers, and the accounts of foreign ambassadors who may have had political motivations for portraying the English heir in unflattering terms. The Burgundian chronicler Enguerrand de Monstrelet, writing decades after the events, describes rumours of Henry's excessive drinking and association with questionable companions, but these accounts lack the specificity and contemporary corroboration that would make them historically reliable. More telling is the absence of serious criticism from English chroniclers, who are otherwise quite willing to document royal misconduct when it occurred. What emerges from careful analysis of the sources is a picture of a young prince who certainly enjoyed the privileges of his position, but whose alleged excesses were likely within the normal bounds of aristocratic behaviour for the period. The court of Henry IV, struggling with the legitimacy crisis that followed the usurpation, could ill afford a genuinely scandalous heir, and the king's continued reliance on his son for military and political responsibilities suggests that any youthful indiscretions remained well within acceptable limits. The prince's documented presence at council meetings, his active participation in military campaigns, and his growing involvement in governmental affairs throughout the 1400s indicate a level of responsibility incompatible with the dissolute lifestyle later attributed to him. The relationship between Prince Henry and his father grew increasingly complex as the young man matured and began developing his own views on military strategy and governmental policy. Henry IV, haunted by the circumstances of his accession and facing persistent challenges to his authority, adopted a cautious approach to both domestic and foreign affairs that often frustrated his more aggressive son. The ongoing Welsh rebellion provided the most significant source of tension between father and son, as their differing strategic philosophies became apparent through their approaches to the conflict. Henry IV's strategy in Wales emphasised containment and gradual pressure, reflecting both the kingdom's limited resources and his awareness that overextension might invite challenges from other quarters. The king understood that his position remained precarious, with Yorkist claimants to the throne still at large and French support for various pretenders always a possibility. This defensive mindset led to a preference for garrisoning strongholds and maintaining defensive positions, rather than pursuing the costly offensive operations that might bring quicker resolution to the Welsh conflict. Prince Henry, by contrast, advocated for more aggressive tactics that would bring decisive results despite their higher costs and risks. His direct experience fighting Glyndwr's forces had convinced him that half measures would only prolong the conflict and drain the kingdom's resources more thoroughly than a concentrated campaign aimed at crushing Welsh resistance once and for all. The prince's proposals for large-scale expeditions into the heart of Welsh territory, supported by substantial financial commitments and reinforcements from other parts of the kingdom, reflected his confidence in English military superiority and his impatience with the grinding war of attrition that had characterized the conflict. These strategic disagreements extended beyond tactical considerations to fundamental questions about resource allocation and governmental priorities. Prince Henry argued that the Welsh rebellion posed an existential threat to Lancastrian authority that required immediate and decisive action, even at the cost of postponing other initiatives. He pointed to Glyndwr's diplomatic efforts to secure French and Scottish support, warning that delay would only allow the rebellion to gain international backing and legitimacy. The prince's memoranda to the Royal Council, preserved in the patent rolls, demonstrates sophisticated political analysis and a clear understanding of the broader European context within which the Welsh conflict was unfolding. The financial implications of these strategic differences created additional friction between father and son. Prince Henry's aggressive approach required substantial expenditures for equipment, supplies, and wages that strained the royal treasury already depleted by the cost of establishing and maintaining the new dynasty. Henry IV's reluctance to commit resources on the scale his son demanded reflected not only fiscal constraints, but also political calculations about the sustainability of heavy taxation and the risk of provoking parliamentary opposition. The king's experience with the rebellion of Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, had demonstrated how military overextension could create vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit. As Henry IV's health began to deteriorate in the later years of his reign, Prince Henry's role in governmental affairs expanded significantly beyond his military responsibilities. The king's recurring bouts of illness, possibly related to stress-induced conditions or more serious underlying health problems, created periods when the prince effectively served as regent in all but name. These interludes provided Henry with invaluable experience in the day-to-day administration of the kingdom and exposed him to the full complexity of royal governance. The prince's participation in council meetings during his father's healthy periods had already familiarised him with the major issues facing the kingdom, from the ongoing negotiations with France to the delicate management of parliamentary relations and the complex web of noble loyalties that sustained Lancastrian rule. However, his assumption of greater executive authority during the king's illnesses allowed him to move beyond advisory roles to actual decision-making responsibilities. The surviving records of council proceedings from this period show Prince Henry taking increasingly prominent roles in discussions of foreign policy, military planning, and domestic administration. One of the most significant areas where Prince Henry exercised growing influence was in the management of relations with Parliament. The Lancastrian dynasty's dependence on parliamentary support for taxation and legislation required careful cultivation of relationships with both the Lords and Commons, a task that demanded political skills quite different from military leadership. The prince demonstrated considerable aptitude for parliamentary management, showing sensitivity to the concerns of different constituencies while advancing royal interests. His speeches to Parliament, recorded in the rolls of proceedings, reveal sophisticated understanding of constitutional precedents and the delicate balance between royal prerogative and parliamentary privilege. The prince's evolving relationship with key nobles during this period reflected both his growing political maturity and the changing dynamics within the English aristocracy as the Lancastrian regime consolidated its position. The great magnates who had supported Henry IV's usurpation expected rewards and recognition for their loyalty, but they also needed to be managed carefully to prevent the development of over-mighty subjects who might threaten royal authority. Prince Henry navigated these relationships with considerable skill, offering appropriate honours and responsibilities while maintaining clear boundaries between royal favour and political independence. The Beaufort family, Henry IV's half-brothers, occupied a particularly important position within this network of noble relationships. Cardinal Henry Beaufort, Bishop of Winchester, had emerged as one of the most influential figures in the kingdom, wielding considerable power in both ecclesiastical and secular affairs. Prince Henry's relationship with his great-uncle was complex, combining genuine respect for Beaufort's political acumen with wariness about his ambitions and influence. The cardinal's vast wealth, derived from his episcopal revenues and money-lending activities, made him an essential ally but also a potential rival for influence over royal policy. Thomas Beaufort, Earl of Dorset and later Duke of Exeter, provided Prince Henry with a trusted military commander and political advisor whose loyalty was secured by family ties but whose competence had been proven through years of service. The prince's reliance on Thomas Beaufort for sensitive missions and important military commands reflected his understanding that effective governance required a careful balance between personal trust and professional capability. The Beaufort connection also provided Prince Henry with access to extensive networks of retainers and allies throughout the kingdom, relationships that would prove crucial during his own reign. The prince's management of his relationship with the Percy family demonstrated his growing sophistication in handling the complex loyalties and grievances that characterized noble politics in the aftermath of usurpation. The Percys had been instrumental in Henry IV's successful challenge to Richard II, but their subsequent rebellion in 1403 had revealed the conditional nature of their support for the Lancastrian dynasty. Prince Henry's victory over Henry Percy at the Battle of Shrewsbury had established his military reputation, but it had also created ongoing tensions with the surviving members of the Percy family that required careful diplomatic management. The gradual rehabilitation of the Percy family during the later years of Henry IV's reign reflected Prince Henry's influence on royal policy and his understanding that permanent alienation of such powerful magnates posed greater risk than controlled reconciliation. The restoration of some Percy estates and titles, accomplished through a series of carefully negotiated agreements, demonstrated the prince's appreciation for the long-term stability that required incorporating former enemies into the governing coalition, rather than maintaining them as permanent opponents. Prince Henry's assumption of greater governmental responsibilities during his father's final years also exposed him to the complex financial challenges facing the English monarchy in the early 15th century. The cost of maintaining the Lancastrian regime, fighting the Welsh rebellion, defending the Scottish border, and meeting the ordinary expenses of royal government had created persistent fiscal pressures that required innovative solutions. The prince's involvement in financial planning during this period provided him with detailed understanding of royal revenues, expenditures, and the political constraints that limited the crown's ability to raise additional funds through taxation. The management of the royal household during Henry IV's periods of incapacity fell increasingly to Prince Henry, giving him practical experience in the administration of the complex institution that served as both the king's domestic establishment and the centre of governmental operations. The household's various departments, from the wardrobe that managed royal finances to the chancery that produced official documents, required coordination and oversight that demanded both administrative skill and political sensitivity. The prince's success in maintaining the smooth operation of these essential governmental functions during his father's illnesses demonstrated his readiness for the full responsibilities of kingship. As the reign of Henry IV drew toward its close, Prince Henry had evolved from the promising but inexperienced youth who had first taken the field against Welsh rebels into a seasoned political and military leader whose influence extended throughout the kingdom. His growing confidence in challenging his father's policies reflected not youthful arrogance but mature judgment, based on extensive experience in the practical challenges of governance. The tensions between father and son that had characterized much of the period represented not personal animosity, but fundamental differences in strategic vision that would profoundly influence the direction of English policy once Prince Henry assumed the throne as Henry I. The death of Henry IV on March 20th, 1413, at Westminster Palace marked the end of a reign characterised by persistent challenges to dynastic legitimacy and the beginning of what would prove to be one of the most transformative periods in English medieval history. The circumstances surrounding the king's final illness had provided Prince Henry with extensive preparation for the transition, as he had effectively managed royal affairs during his father's periods of incapacity. Nevertheless, the formal assumption of the crown brought with it a unique set of challenges that required immediate attention and careful navigation of both domestic and international expectations. The coronation ceremony at Westminster Abbey on April 9th, 1413, represented far more than a ceremonial transition of power. It constituted a critical opportunity for the new king to establish the legitimacy of Lancastrian rule and demonstrate his fitness for the throne. The elaborate ritual conducted by Archbishop Thomas Arundel of Canterbury followed the ancient forms that had sanctified English kings since the Norman conquest, yet every element carried special significance given the circumstances of the dynasty's foundation. The presence of virtually the entire English nobility assembled in the abbey's soaring nave beneath its magnificent rose windows provided visible testimony to the acceptance of Henry's authority by the kingdom's most powerful men. The coronation regalia itself bore witness to the continuity of English kingship, despite the dynastic disruption of 1399. Henry V was crowned with the same golden circlet that had adorned the heads of his Plantagenet predecessors, anointed with the sacred chrism that symbolically transformed him from mortal prince to divinely appointed monarch. The ceremony's most profound moment came when Archbishop Arundel placed the crown upon Henry's head while reciting the ancient formula that invoked God's blessing upon the new sovereign. The assembled congregation's thunderous acclamation of Vivat Rex Henricus echoed through the abbey's stone vaults, formally acknowledging the completion of the transition that had begun with his father's death 3 weeks earlier. The immediate aftermath of the coronation revealed the extent of Henry V's preparation for kingship and his determination to establish a markedly different tone from his father's reign. Where Henry IV had been forced to rely heavily on the magnates who had supported his usurpation, often at the cost of royal independence, the new king demonstrated from his first days on the throne that he intended to govern as a truly sovereign monarch. His initial proclamations, issued from Westminster Palace in the days following the coronation, addressed the major concerns that had plagued his father's reign while establishing clear expectations for the conduct of his subjects in the direction of royal policy. One of Henry V's most striking early decisions involved his approach to former enemies of the Lancastrian dynasty, particularly those nobles who had suffered forfeiture or exile as a result of their opposition to Henry IV. Rather than maintaining the vindictive policies that had characterized much of the previous reign, the new king implemented a carefully calculated program of reconciliation that demonstrated both political wisdom and genuine confidence in his own authority. The restoration of Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March, to his full titles and estates exemplified this approach, as Mortimer possessed a strong hereditary claim to the throne through his descent from Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, Edward III's second surviving son. The decision to restore Mortimer required considerable political courage, as many of Henry's advisers viewed the Earl as a potential focal point for Yorkist opposition to Lancastrian rule. Henry V's willingness to take this risk reflected his understanding that the dynasty's long-term security depended not on the suppression of rival claimants, but on the creation of a political environment in which such claims became irrelevant due to the overwhelming success and legitimacy of Lancastrian governance. The elaborate ceremony at which Mortimer performed homage to Henry V in Westminster Hall, witnessed by the assembled court, served to demonstrate both the king's magnanimity and the Earl's acceptance of Lancastrian authority. Similarly, Henry's treatment of the surviving members of the Percy family revealed his sophisticated understanding of the delicate balance between justice and reconciliation that effective kingship required. The restoration of Henry Percy, son of the Hotspur killed at Shrewsbury, to the earldom of Northumberland represented a calculated risk that ultimately strengthened rather than weakened royal authority. The young Percy's gratitude for his restoration, combined with his family's traditional role as defenders of the northern marches against Scottish incursion, provided Henry V with a powerful ally whose loyalty was secured by royal favour rather than compelled by fear. The king's religious policies during his first year on the throne demonstrated his commitment to Orthodox Christianity and his determination to present himself as a pious ruler worthy of divine support. The Lancastrian dynasty's association with religious reform movements, particularly the Lollard heresy that had found support among some of Henry IV's early allies, had created suspicions about the family's doctrinal reliability that required careful management. Henry's aggressive prosecution of Lollard leaders, including the execution of Sir John Oldcastle after his involvement in a failed plot against the king, served multiple purposes in establishing royal orthodoxy and eliminating potential sources of political opposition. The suppression of Lollard heresy involved more than simple religious persecution. It represented a comprehensive effort to eliminate a movement that challenged both ecclesiastical authority and the social order that supported royal power. Lollard teachings, with their emphasis on individual interpretation of scripture and criticism of clerical wealth and privilege, posed implicit challenges to the hierarchical structure of medieval society. Henry V's cooperation with Archbishop Arundel in rooting out heretical beliefs demonstrated his understanding that religious orthodoxy and political stability were intimately connected in an age when divine sanction provided the ultimate justification for royal authority. The trial and execution of Sir John Oldcastle in 1414 provided Henry V with an opportunity to demonstrate his commitment to religious orthodoxy while eliminating a dangerous political opponent. Oldcastle, a former companion of the king during his days as Prince of Wales, had embraced Lollard beliefs and used his position among the Herefordshire gentry to promote heretical teachings. His involvement in a conspiracy to capture or kill Henry V during the Christmas celebrations of 1413 transformed a religious matter into a case of high treason that demanded the ultimate penalty. The king's willingness to execute a former friend for heresy and treason sent a clear message about the boundaries of acceptable behaviour under the new regime. The administrative reforms implemented during Henry V's first year as king reflected his determination to create a more efficient and centralised governmental system than had existed under his father. The expansion of the royal chancery, with its corps of trained clerks responsible for producing the documents that carried royal commands throughout the kingdom, enabled more systematic oversight of local administration and more effective implementation of royal policies. The establishment of regular audit procedures for royal revenues, overseen by trusted officials answerable directly to the king, helped address the chronic fiscal problems that had plagued the Lancastrian dynasty since its inception. Henry's approach to parliamentary relations during his early reign demonstrated his understanding that effective kingship required the cooperation of the kingdom's representative institutions while maintaining clear boundaries around royal prerogative. The Parliament that assembled at Westminster in May 1413 witnessed the new king's first major address to the assembled Lords and Commons, a speech that outlined his vision for the realm and established the themes that would dominate his reign. Henry's emphasis on the restoration of English honour, the pursuit of justice, and the defence of the realm's interests resonated with parliamentary expectations, while carefully avoiding specific commitments that might constrain royal freedom of action. The king's management of the complex relationship between royal authority and parliamentary privilege required delicate balancing of competing interests and expectations. The Commons' traditional right to grant or withhold taxation needed to be respected, but Henry V was determined to avoid the kind of parliamentary constraints that had limited his father's freedom of action. The generous subsidies voted by the 1413 Parliament reflected both the Assembly's confidence in the new king and his skill in presenting royal needs in terms that appealed to parliamentary concerns about national honour and security. The diplomatic initiatives launched during Henry V's first year as king revealed his intention to pursue a more aggressive foreign policy than had characterised his father's reign. The careful cultivation of relationships with continental powers, particularly the complex negotiations with both Armagnac and Burgundian factions in France, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of European politics and strategic planning that extended far beyond immediate military considerations. Henry's ambassadors, drawn from the ranks of experienced diplomats and trusted clerics, carried instructions that reflected long-term strategic thinking about England's role in continental affairs. The revival of English claims to the French throne represented perhaps the most significant policy departure of Henry V's early reign, transforming what had been a largely dormant legal assertion into an active diplomatic and military objective. The king's decision to press these claims reflected multiple considerations beyond simple territorial ambition. The unification of English opinion behind a foreign war offered opportunities to channel domestic tensions outward, while establishing the kind of military glory that medieval kingship required for full legitimacy. The potential financial rewards of successful conquest in France, including both immediate plunder and long-term territorial revenues, provided practical incentives that complemented the ideological appeal of recovering England's rightful inheritance. The legal foundations for English claims to the French throne rested on the complex inheritance patterns that had characterised European royal families since the Norman conquest. Edward III's assertion of his right to inherit the French crown through his mother Isabella, daughter of Philip IV of France, had provided the original justification for what became the 100 Years' War. Although French lawyers had developed the doctrine of Salic law to exclude inheritance through the female line, English legal opinion had never accepted this limitation, maintaining that the crown of France belonged rightfully to the English kings as heirs of Isabella. Henry V's diplomatic approach to the French question demonstrated remarkable sophistication in its combination of legal argumentation, military preparation, and strategic alliance building. The king's ambassadors presented detailed genealogical evidence supporting English claims while simultaneously negotiating with various French factions about potential territorial settlements that might avoid the necessity of military action. These parallel diplomatic tracks allowed Henry to maintain pressure on the French government while preserving options for either negotiated settlement or military conquest depending on circumstances. The domestic impact of Henry's foreign policy initiatives became apparent in the enthusiastic response of the English nobility to the prospect of renewed warfare in France. The generation of nobles that had come of age during the relatively peaceful later years of Henry IV's reign had been denied the opportunities for military glory and financial advancement that their fathers had enjoyed during the great campaigns of Edward III and the Black Prince. The king's careful cultivation of noble support for his French ambitions tapped into this reservoir of frustrated martial ambition, while providing practical outlets for the competitive energies that might otherwise have been directed toward domestic political conflicts. The financial preparations for potential military action in France required careful coordination between royal resources, parliamentary grants, and private contributions from nobles eager to participate in profitable campaigns. Henry's success in securing adequate funding for his military preparations reflected both his skill in presenting the French war as a national enterprise and his understanding of the economic incentives that motivated different segments of English society. The prospect of territorial conquest in France appealed to nobles seeking new estates and revenues, while merchants anticipated the commercial opportunities that would follow successful military campaigns. The military preparations that characterised the latter part of 1413 and early 1414 reveal the extent of Henry's strategic planning and his determination to avoid the logistical failures that had hampered previous English expeditions to the continent. The systematic accumulation of weapons, supplies, and transport vessels demonstrated professional military planning that drew upon the lessons learned during the Welsh campaigns and incorporated innovations in siege warfare and battlefield tactics that had emerged from continental conflicts. The recruitment of experienced military commanders, many of whom had served with distinction during the suppression of the Welsh rebellion, provided the new expedition with proven leadership capable of implementing the king's strategic vision. The transformation in Henry V's public persona during his first year as king represented one of the most remarkable aspects of his early reign. The young man who had occasionally clashed with his father over policy and strategy emerged as a monarch whose piety, determination, and strategic vision commanded widespread respect and admiration. This dramatic change reflected not mere political calculation, but genuine personal development as Henry embraced the full responsibilities of kingship and the unique challenges facing the Lancastrian dynasty in the early 15th century. The consolidation of Henry's authority during his first year as king had created an impression of domestic stability that masked underlying tensions within the English political establishment. The restoration of former enemies and the king's conciliatory approach toward potential rivals had indeed strengthened royal authority, but it had also created opportunities for those who remained fundamentally opposed to Lancastrian rule to organise more sophisticated resistance. The discovery of the Southampton plot in the summer of 1415 revealed the persistence of dynastic opposition and the complex web of personal grievances financial pressures, and foreign influences that continued to threaten the stability of Henry's regime. The conspiracy that would become known as the Southampton Plot emerged from the intersection of several distinct but related sources of opposition to Lancastrian rule. At its centre stood Richard, Earl of Cambridge, younger brother of Edward, Duke of York, whose participation in the plot reflected both personal financial desperation and genuine belief in the superior legitimacy of alternative claimants to the English throne. Cambridge had married Anne Mortimer, sister of Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March, whose Yorkist lineage provided a stronger hereditary claim to the crown than the Lancastrian dynasty could offer. The Earl's mounting debts, exacerbated by his exclusion from the lucrative offices and grants that Henry V had distributed among his supporters, created practical incentives for rebellion that complemented ideological opposition to usurped authority. Henry, Lord Scrope of Masham, represented a different category of conspirator whose involvement demonstrated the complex personal and political calculations that shaped noble loyalty in the early 15th century. Scrope had served Henry faithfully during his time as Prince of Wales, and had initially appeared to accept the new king's authority without reservation. His participation in the conspiracy reflected not ancient grievances against the Lancastrian dynasty, but more immediate concerns about his position within the royal court and his access to the king's favour. The lord's financial difficulties, combined with his perception that other nobles had received preferential treatment in the distribution of royal patronage, created resentments that made him susceptible to recruitment by more committed opponents of the regime. Sir Thomas Grey of Hetton brought to the conspiracy the practical, military experience and regional connections that transformed it from a theoretical challenge to royal authority into a potentially viable threat to the king's security. Grey's estates in Northumberland provided access to the border regions where Scottish support for anti-Lancastrian activities remained a persistent concern, while his military background offered the technical knowledge necessary to plan and execute armed resistance. His involvement in the plot reflected the broader problem of managing the expectations and loyalties of the military class that had supported the Lancastrian usurpation, but now found itself excluded from the rewards of renewed continental warfare. The conspiracy's foreign dimensions revealed the international context within which domestic opposition to Henry VIII had operated, and the continuing efforts of England's enemies to exploit internal divisions within the kingdom. French gold, channeled through complex networks of merchants and diplomats, provided the financial resources that enabled the conspirators to contemplate serious resistance to royal authority. The French court's support for the plot reflected both immediate strategic calculations about disrupting Henry V's preparations for continental warfare and longer-term objectives of weakening English power through the promotion of civil conflict. Scottish involvement in the conspiracy, though less direct than French participation, demonstrated the persistent threat that England's northern neighbour posed to Lancastrian security. The complex relationship between the Scottish court and various English noble families, particularly those with estates in the border regions, created opportunities for coordinated action against the English crown that transcended simple national boundaries. The conspirators' communications with Scottish agents, intercepted by royal intelligence networks, revealed plans for coordinated uprisings that would have stretched English military resources beyond their capacity to respond effectively. The plot's intended beneficiary, Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March, occupied a uniquely awkward position within the conspiracy that reflected the complex dynamics of dynastic legitimacy in early 15th century England. Mortimer's stronger hereditary claim to the throne, based on his descent from Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, made him the natural focal point for opposition to Lancastrian rule, yet his restoration to full honours by Henry V had created obligations of loyalty that complicated his relationship with the conspirators. The Earl's ultimate decision to reveal the plot to royal authorities demonstrated both his personal integrity and his recognition that successful rebellion would require broader support than the conspirators had managed to assemble. The discovery of the Southampton plot unfolded through a combination of loyal intelligence gathering and the conspirators' own security failures that exposed their activities to royal surveillance. Henry V's intelligence network, developed during the Welsh campaigns and expanded during his early years as king, had established monitoring systems that tracked the movements and communications of potentially disloyal nobles. The interception of correspondence between the conspirators and their foreign contacts provided royal agents with detailed knowledge of the plot's scope and timing, enabling them to prepare countermeasures before the conspiracy could mature into active rebellion. The king's response to the discovery of the plot demonstrated the decisive leadership style that would characterize his entire reign, and his understanding that mercy toward traitors would be interpreted as weakness rather than magnanimity. The immediate arrest of the principal conspirators, carried out by trusted royal agents in a coordinated operation that prevented any possibility of escape or resistance, revealed the efficiency of the intelligence apparatus that Henry V had constructed to protect his authority. The speed with which the arrests were executed, occurring simultaneously in different locations to prevent warning between conspirators, demonstrated professional security planning that reflected the king's military background and his appreciation for the importance of tactical surprise. The trial of the Southampton conspirators provided Henry V with an opportunity to demonstrate both the justice of his rule and the consequences of treason against legitimate royal authority. The proceedings, conducted according to established legal procedures but with careful attention to their political implications, revealed the extent of the conspiracy while establishing clear precedents for the treatment of future challenges to Lancastrian rule. The king's decision to preside personally over portions of the trial demonstrated his confidence in the evidence against the conspirators and his determination to ensure that justice was both done and seen to be done. Richard, Earl of Cambridge, faced the ultimate penalty for his leadership role in the conspiracy, his execution serving as a stark reminder of the boundaries that Henry V would not permit his subjects to cross. The Earl's final speech from the scaffold, acknowledging his guilt while expressing hope for divine mercy, provided a dramatic conclusion to a life that had been shaped by the complex inheritance patterns and financial pressures that characterised noble existence in the early 15th century. Cambridge's death eliminated a potential focal point for future Yorkist opposition, while demonstrating the king's willingness to execute even high-ranking nobles when they threatened the security of his regime. Lord Scrope's execution alongside Cambridge reinforced the message that neither previous service to the crown nor noble rank would protect traitors from the consequences of their actions. Scrope's final moments, marked by expressions of remorse for his betrayal of royal trust, highlighted the personal dimension of treason that went beyond simple political opposition to encompass violations of the bonds of loyalty and service that held medieval society together. His death served as a warning to other nobles who might be tempted to allow personal grievances or financial difficulties to override their obligations to the crown. Sir Thomas Grey's fate completed the triumvirate of executions that marked the end of the Southampton plot and established clear precedents for Henry V's treatment of domestic opposition. Grey's military background, which had initially made him valuable to the conspiracy, ultimately provided no protection against the consequences of treason, demonstrating that the king's justice applied equally to all ranks of society. The public nature of the executions, carried out before assembled crowds that included many nobles and officials, ensured that the lessons of the Southampton plot would be widely understood throughout the kingdom. The suppression of the Southampton plot cleared the way for Henry's continental ambitions, while simultaneously strengthening his domestic position through the elimination of the most serious internal threat to his authority. The conspiracy's failure demonstrated both the effectiveness of royal intelligence networks and the fundamental weakness of opposition to Lancastrian rule, as the plotters had been unable to assemble the broad coalition of support that successful rebellion required. The king's decisive response to the threat enhanced his reputation for strong leadership while providing practical evidence of his determination to protect the dynasty's interests against all challenges. The military preparations that had continued throughout the period of the Southampton plots, development and suppression revealed the scope of Henry VI's ambitions for continental warfare and his systematic approach to the complex logistical challenges that such campaigns required. The recruitment of soldiers for the French expedition involved careful attention to both the quality and quantity of forces needed to achieve the king's strategic objectives, drawing upon the military experience accumulated during the Welsh campaigns, while incorporating tactical innovations that reflected contemporary developments in European warfare. The systematic organisation of military units, with clearly defined command structures and specified equipment requirements, demonstrated professional planning that went far beyond the improvised arrangements that had characterised many previous English expeditions. The financial arrangements for the French campaign required unprecedented coordination between royal resources, parliamentary grants, and private contributions from nobles and merchants eager to participate in profitable military ventures. Henry's success in securing adequate funding reflected both his skill in presenting the war as a national enterprise that would benefit all segments of English society and his understanding of the economic incentives that motivated different constituencies. The careful accounting procedures established to track expenditures and ensure proper use of funds demonstrated administrative sophistication that would prove crucial to the campaign's ultimate success. The diplomatic preparations for war involved complex negotiations with multiple European powers as Henry V sought to isolate France while securing allies and preventing hostile coalitions from forming against English interests. The king's ambassadors, selected for their experience in continental affairs and their understanding of the intricate relationships between European courts, carried instructions that reflected sophisticated strategic thinking about the broader political context within which military action would occur. The simultaneous pursuit of negotiations with both Armagnac and Burgundian factions in France demonstrated Henry's appreciation for the opportunities that French civil war created for English advancement, while maintaining flexibility about potential alliance arrangements. The alliance with Burgundy, though not yet formalised into binding treaty obligations, represented the most significant diplomatic achievement of Henry V's pre-war preparations and reflected his understanding of the crucial role that French internal divisions would play in any English military campaign. Duke John the Fearless of Burgundy, locked in deadly conflict with the Armagnac faction for control of the French government, found in English pressure on France a useful complement to his own military and political objectives. The careful coordination between English diplomatic initiatives and Burgundian military operations created opportunities for mutual support that neither party could have achieved independently. The systematic accumulation of siege equipment and artillery demonstrated Henry's recognition that success in France would require the capture of fortified positions and his determination to possess the technical capabilities necessary for effective siege warfare. The recruitment of skilled engineers and artisans, many of them drawn from continental sources where siege technology had advanced beyond English capabilities, provided the expedition with professional expertise that would prove decisive in subsequent operations. The careful testing and calibration of cannons and other artillery pieces, conducted at royal facilities under the supervision of experienced gunners, ensured that the English forces would possess reliable and effective siege capabilities. The naval preparations for the French campaign revealed the extent of Henry V's strategic planning and his understanding that control of the English Channel would be essential to the success of any continental expedition. The systematic recruitment of ships from English ports, supplemented by vessels hired from foreign merchants and allies, created a fleet capable of transporting the substantial forces and supplies that the king's ambitious plans required. The appointment of experienced naval commanders, drawn from the ranks of men who had distinguished themselves in previous maritime operations, provided the expedition with professional leadership capable of managing the complex logistical challenges that large-scale amphibious operations demanded. The failure of diplomatic negotiations with the French court by July 1415 provided Henry V with the justification he required to transform months of military preparation into active warfare. The French response to English territorial demands had been predictably dismissive, with the Dauphin Louis reportedly sending a chest of tennis balls to mock Henry's youth and supposed frivolity. Whether this insulting gesture actually occurred remains debatable among chroniclers, but the underlying French contempt for English claims was unmistakable. Charles VI's government, despite its internal divisions between Armagnac and Burgundian factions, remained united in rejecting Henry's assertion of sovereignty over substantial portions of France, including Normandy, Anjou, and ultimately the Crown itself. The English invasion fleet that assembled in Portsmouth Harbour during late July and early August 1415 represented the largest military expedition to leave English shores since Edward III's campaigns of the previous century. Contemporary accounts describe a forest of masts stretching across the Solent, with vessels of every description pressed into service to transport Henry's army across the Channel. The King's own ship, the Trinity Royal, served as flagship for a fleet that included over 1,500 vessels, ranging from purpose-built warships to converted merchant vessels and fishing boats. The logistical complexity of organising this maritime armada required unprecedented coordination between royal officials, ship owners, and the port authorities of Southampton, Portsmouth, and other southern harbours. The army that boarded these ships reflected Henry's careful attention to the composition and capabilities required for his ambitious continental campaign. The core of the force consisted of approximately 2,500 men-at-arms, heavily armoured cavalry, and dismounted knights who would provide the expedition's striking power in major engagements. These professional warriors, drawn from the ranks of the English nobility and gentry, brought with them decades of collective experience from the Welsh campaigns and represented the finest military talent available to the English crown. Each man-at-arms was accompanied by multiple servants, pages and support personnel who would maintain equipment, tend horses, and provide the logistical foundation that enabled medieval armies to function effectively in hostile territory. The expedition's archery contingent numbered approximately 8,000 longbowmen, representing the largest concentration of this uniquely English military asset ever assembled for overseas service. These men, recruited primarily from the yeomanry of the Welsh marches and northern counties, where archery skills remained essential for local defence, possessed the specialised training and physical conditioning required to draw the powerful warbows that had revolutionised medieval battlefield tactics. The systematic recruitment of archers from specific regions reflected Henry's understanding that effective longbow warfare required not just individual skill, but collective training and coordination that could only be achieved through shared military culture and experience. The siege train that accompanied Henry's army demonstrated his recognition that success in France would depend primarily on the capture of fortified positions, rather than victory in open battle. The expedition's artillery included both traditional siege engines, such as trebuchets and mangonels, and the newer gunpowder weapons that were beginning to transform siege warfare throughout Europe. The cannons transported aboard the invasion fleet represented some of the most advanced military technology available, with bronze and iron guns capable of breaching the strongest medieval fortifications when properly deployed and supplied with adequate ammunition. The decision to begin the campaign with an assault on Harfleur reflected Henry's strategic understanding of the importance of establishing a secure base for subsequent operations, while simultaneously demonstrating English military capabilities to both French and European audiences. Harfleur's position at the mouth of the Seine River made it one of the most important commercial and military ports in northern France, controlling access to the French interior while serving as a base for naval operations that threatened English shipping in the Channel. The town's formidable fortifications, recently strengthened with the latest defensive innovations, would provide a stern test of English siege capabilities while offering substantial strategic rewards if captured successfully. The English fleet departed Portsmouth on August 11, 1415, with favourable winds that carried the invasion armada across the Channel in a single day's sailing. The sight of hundreds of English vessels approaching the Norman coast created panic among French coastal communities, many of which had not witnessed hostile landings since the previous century. The systematic disembarkation of troops, equipment, and supplies at the mouth of the Seine demonstrated the professional planning that had characterised Henry's preparations, with designated landing areas for different components of the army and predetermined assembly points that minimised the confusion typically associated with amphibious operations. The investment of Harfleur began on August 18, 1415, as English forces established siege lines that completely surrounded the town and cut off all communication with the French interior. The deployment of siege equipment revealed the sophisticated understanding of military engineering that Henry's commanders had developed through their experiences in Wales and their study of continental siege warfare techniques. The positioning of artillery batteries to concentrate fire on specific sections of the town's walls demonstrated tactical coordination between different siege units, while the construction of protective earthworks and palisades provided English forces with secure positions from which to conduct extended operations. The defenders of Harfleur, commanded by Raoul de Gaucourt and Jean d'Estouteville, possessed both the military experience and local knowledge necessary to mount effective resistance against the English assault. The town's garrison included approximately 400 professional soldiers supplemented by armed civilians, whose familiarity with the local terrain and defensive preparations compensated for their lack of formal military training. The defenders' systematic destruction of buildings and structures outside the town walls denied the English army shelter and supplies, while creating clear fields of fire that made direct assault extremely costly. The siege artilleries deployed by both sides represented the cutting edge of early 15th century military technology, with massive stone-throwing engines supplemented by the newer gunpowder weapons that were beginning to dominate European siege warfare. The English bombardment of Harfleur's walls created breaches that required constant repair by the defenders, while French counter-battery fire targeted English siege positions and supply areas. The thunderous noise of cannon fire, audible for miles across the Norman countryside, announced to the surrounding population that a new phase of the 100 Years' War had begun with unprecedented destructive capabilities. The most devastating enemy faced by Henry's army during the siege proved to be neither French military resistance nor the town's formidable defences, but the dysentery and other diseases that swept through the English camp with catastrophic effect. The unsanitary conditions inevitable in medieval military camps, exacerbated by the summer heat and the army's dependence on local water sources of questionable quality, created ideal conditions for the spread of epidemic diseases that medieval medical knowledge was powerless to combat effectively. Contemporary chroniclers describe the horrific scenes within the English siege lines as hundreds of soldiers succumbed daily to intestinal ailments that left them too weak to fight or even maintain basic camp duties. The impact of disease on the English army's effectiveness became apparent as the siege dragged on through August and into September, with casualty rates from illness far exceeding those from enemy action. Prominent nobles, including Richard Courtenay, Bishop of Norwich, and Michael de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, died from disease during the siege, their deaths highlighting the democratic nature of medieval epidemic illness that struck down great lords and common soldiers with equal ferocity. The systematic evacuation of sick soldiers back to England reduced Henry's effective fighting strength by approximately 1/3, forcing him to reconsider his strategic objectives and the feasibility of extended campaigning in hostile territory. The prolonged resistance of Harfleur's defenders created mounting pressure on Henry V to demonstrate tangible results from his expensive expedition, while simultaneously dealing with the practical challenges posed by his army's declining strength and morale. The king's personal involvement in siege operations, including his presence in forward positions during artillery bombardments, demonstrated the hands-on leadership style that would characterize his entire military career. His willingness to share the dangers faced by common soldiers enhanced his reputation among the troops while providing practical experience in the realities of siege warfare that would prove invaluable in subsequent campaigns. The breakthrough in the siege came in mid-September, when sustained English artillery fire created breaches in Harfleur's walls that the depleted garrison could no longer adequately defend. The defenders' recognition that further resistance would only result in the town's capture by storm, with all the attendant horrors that medieval military law permitted against cities taken by force, led to negotiations for surrender on terms that would preserve the lives and property of the civilian population. The formal capitulation on September 22, 1415, provided Henry V with his first major victory of the campaign, while establishing English control over one of France's most important channel ports. The terms of Harfleur's surrender reflected both medieval conventions regarding siege warfare and Henry's strategic objectives for his continental campaign. The town's military garrison received safe conduct to withdraw with their weapons and personal possessions, while civilian residents who acknowledged Henry as their rightful sovereign were permitted to remain in their homes and continue their normal occupations. Those French inhabitants who refused to accept English rule faced expulsion from the town, their properties and possessions becoming available for distribution among English settlers who would establish a permanent English presence in Normandy. The transformation of Harfleur into an English stronghold required immediate attention to both military and civilian administration that would ensure the town's continued loyalty and effectiveness as a base for future operations. Henry V appointed his uncle Thomas Beaufort, Earl of Dorset, as captain of the conquered town, providing it with a commander whose military experience and political connections ensured adequate resources for defence and development. The establishment of English administrative structures, including courts, customs officials and tax collectors, demonstrated Henry's intention to treat his Norman conquests as permanent additions to the English realm rather than temporary military occupations. The strategic situation facing Henry V following the capture of Harfleur presented him with difficult choices that would determine the direction of the remainder of his campaign. The original plan for extended operations in Normandy had been compromised by the heavy casualties suffered during the siege and the approaching winter weather that would make large-scale military operations increasingly difficult. The king's military advisers, including several who had participated in previous continental campaigns, recommended immediate return to England with the substantial gains already achieved, arguing that consolidation of the Harfleur conquest would provide a foundation for renewed operations in the following year. Henry's decision to march his depleted army overland to Calais rather than embarking directly from Harfleur for England reflected both his understanding of the political implications of military leadership and his assessment of the strategic opportunities created by French political divisions. The king recognised that a simple withdrawal to England after capturing a single town, regardless of its strategic importance, would fail to achieve the psychological impact necessary to establish English credibility as a major continental power. The demonstration of English military capabilities through a march across hostile French territory would serve notice to European powers that the new Lancastrian king possessed both the will and the capability to pursue his continental ambitions with unprecedented determination. The practical challenges facing the proposed march to Calais were formidable, involving the movement of approximately 9,000 men across 160 miles of hostile territory, while maintaining adequate supplies and avoiding the substantial French forces that were beginning to concentrate in response to the English invasion. The route selected by Henry's commanders followed the coastal regions of Normandy and Picardy, providing access to potential supply sources while avoiding the heavily fortified interior regions where French resistance would be strongest. The systematic organisation of the march, with predetermined daily objectives and designated supply points, demonstrated the professional military planning that had characterised Henry's entire campaign. The French response to Henry's march toward Calais revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the divided French government's military capabilities. The Constable Charles d'Albret succeeded in assembling a substantial army that included many of the greatest names in French chivalry, but the force lacked the unified command structure and strategic coordination necessary for effective operations against a disciplined and experienced enemy. The competing ambitions of various French nobles, combined with the ongoing political divisions between Armagnac and Burgundian factions, created command difficulties that would prove decisive in the subsequent battle. The English army's progress toward Calais proceeded without major incident through the first week of October, as French forces shadowed the march without attempting direct confrontation. The systematic foraging operations conducted by English scouting parties provided adequate supplies for the army, while demonstrating to French civilians the reality of English military power and the inability of their own government to provide effective protection. The psychological impact of the English march, conducted with apparent impunity through regions that had not seen foreign armies for decades, created political pressures on the French court to demonstrate military capability through direct action against the invaders. The convergence of English and French armies in the region between the Somme and Othie rivers during the third week of October 1415 created the conditions that would lead to one of the most decisive battles in medieval military history. The French army's successful blocking of Henry's direct route to Calais forced the English king to seek alternative crossings of the Somme, while avoiding the increasingly aggressive French forces that sought to bring him to battle on terms favourable to their superior numbers. The complex manoeuvring that characterised this phase of the campaign demonstrated the tactical skills of both armies while setting the stage for the climactic encounter that would determine the fate of Henry's ambitious expedition. The Battle of Agincourt on October 25, 1415, emerged from the tactical situation created when the French army successfully positioned itself across Henry's line of march near the village of Agincourt, forcing the English king to choose between battle and the abandonment of his strategic objectives. The battlefield itself, a narrow strip of recently ploughed fields bounded by dense woods on both flanks, created terrain conditions that would prove crucial to the battle's outcome by limiting the French army's ability to deploy its superior numbers effectively, while providing ideal conditions for English longbow tactics. The aftermath of Agincourt transformed Henry V from a promising but untested English king into the dominant military figure of early 15th century Europe, fundamentally altering the diplomatic landscape across the continent. The scale of French losses at the battle, which had decimated an entire generation of French nobility, while leaving English casualties at fewer than 30 men, created a power vacuum that drew the attention of every major European ruler. The Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, engaged in his own complex struggles to maintain imperial authority across Central Europe, while simultaneously pursuing the resolution of the Great Western Schism that had divided the Catholic Church for nearly 4 decades, recognised in Henry's stunning victory an opportunity to forge new alliances that might serve multiple strategic objectives. Sigismund's decision to visit England in the spring of 1416 represented one of the most significant diplomatic initiatives of the medieval period, marking the first time a Holy Roman Emperor had set foot on English soil since the Norman conquest. The Emperor's arrival at Dover on May 1st, 1416, accompanied by a retinue of nearly 300 knights, clerics and officials, created a sensation throughout England as crowds gathered to witness this unprecedented display of imperial recognition for English power. The elaborate ceremonial reception organised by Henry V demonstrated his understanding of the propaganda value inherent in receiving such a distinguished visitor, with processions through London that showcased both English wealth and the international respect that Agincourt had earned for the Lancastrian dynasty. The substantive negotiations between Henry V and Sigismund unfolded over several weeks of intensive diplomatic activity that revealed the sophisticated understanding both rulers possessed of the complex relationships binding European powers together. Sigismund's primary objective involved securing English support for his efforts to resolve the papal schism through the Council of Constance, where his imperial authority provided crucial leverage in negotiations between competing papal claimants. Henry's willingness to support conciliar solutions to the schism reflected both his genuine concern for church unity and his recognition that cooperation with imperial religious policies would strengthen the broader alliance he sought to construct against French power. The military dimensions of the Anglo-Imperial alliance took shape through detailed discussions about coordinated action against French interests across multiple theatres of operation. Sigismund's ongoing conflicts with various German princes who maintained French connections created opportunities for English diplomatic and financial support that would stretch French resources while providing the emperor with crucial assistance in his struggle to maintain imperial authority. The systematic exchange of intelligence about French diplomatic activities, military preparations, and financial resources established cooperative mechanisms that would prove invaluable in subsequent campaigns against the divided French monarchy. The commercial aspects of the Anglo-Imperial Agreement reflected Henry V's sophisticated understanding of the economic foundations that sustained medieval warfare and diplomacy. The establishment of preferential trading arrangements between English merchants and imperial territories provided practical benefits that complemented the military alliance while creating constituencies within both realms that possessed vested interests in maintaining cooperative relationships. The systematic coordination of policies regarding Flemish commerce, where English wool exports intersected with imperial territorial claims, demonstrated the complex interplay between economic and political considerations that characterized early 15th century European diplomacy. The ceremonial climax of Sigismund's visit occurred with his investiture of Henry V as a Knight of the Order of the Dragon, the chivalric order the emperor had founded to promote crusading ideals and imperial unity. The elaborate ceremony conducted at Westminster Abbey, witnessed by the assembled English nobility and foreign ambassadors, provided powerful symbolic reinforcement for the alliance while establishing Henry's credentials as a legitimate participant in the highest levels of European aristocratic society. The reciprocal honour bestowed upon Sigismund through his admission to the Order of the Garter created lasting bonds between the imperial and English courts that would survive the immediate political circumstances that had created the alliance. The transformation of European diplomatic alignments achieved through the Anglo-Imperial alliance became apparent in the systematic isolation of France from potential sources of support and assistance. The emperor's influence over German princes who had traditionally maintained French connections created pressure for the abandonment of pro-French policies, while English financial resources provided practical incentives for cooperation with the new alliance. The coordination of diplomatic initiatives across multiple European courts demonstrated the sophisticated strategic planning that both Henry and Sigismund brought to their partnership, creating a network of relationships that fundamentally altered the balance of power across the continent. The renewed English military operations in Normandy that began in August 1417 reflected Henry VI's recognition that the diplomatic advantages gained through the imperial alliance required reinforcement through continued military success that would demonstrate English power while expanding territorial control over strategically important regions. The systematic approach adopted for the conquest of Normandy differed significantly from the opportunistic raiding that had characterized previous English expeditions to France, involving instead a coordinated campaign of siege warfare designed to establish permanent English control over the entire duchy through the capture and fortification of key strongholds. The Siege of Caen, which began on August 18, 1417, provided the first major test of the innovative siege techniques that Henry's military engineers had developed through their experiences at Harfleur and their study of continental siege warfare innovations. The the deployment of artillery batteries in coordinated patterns that concentrated fire on specific sections of the city's walls demonstrated tactical sophistication that went far beyond the crude bombardment techniques employed in earlier campaigns. The systematic construction of siege works that protected English forces while providing platforms for artillery and assault operations revealed professional military engineering capabilities that rivaled the best continental practices. The capture of Caen after a siege lasting 3 weeks established patterns of conquest and administration that would characterise English operations throughout Normandy. The systematic documentation of captured territories, including detailed surveys of agricultural resources, commercial facilities and defensive capabilities, provided the foundation for efficient administrative control that transformed military conquest into permanent territorial acquisition. The appointment of English officials to oversee local government, tax collection and judicial proceedings created institutional mechanisms that integrated Norman territories into the broader English administrative system while maintaining local customs and practices that ensured popular acceptance of English rule. The siege warfare techniques employed during the Norman conquest incorporated innovations in artillery deployment that reflected Henry V's commitment to maintaining technological superiority over French defensive capabilities. The development of mobile artillery platforms that could be rapidly repositioned during siege operations provided tactical flexibility that enabled English forces to respond effectively to changing defensive conditions while maintaining continuous pressure on besieged garrisons. The systematic coordination between artillery bombardment and infantry assault operations demonstrated combined arms tactics that maximised the effectiveness of different military specialties while minimising casualties among English forces. The administrative systems established in conquered Norman territories reflected Henry's understanding that military success required complementary civilian institutions capable of maintaining order, collecting revenues, and providing services that would secure popular loyalty to English rule. The retention of existing Norman legal traditions and commercial practices, administered through English-appointed officials who possessed both military experience and administrative competence, created governmental structures that balanced respect for local customs with the requirements of effective royal control. The systematic integration of Norman revenues into English financial systems provided crucial resources for continued military operations, while demonstrating the practical benefits that territorial conquest could provide for royal finances. The fall of Rouen on January 19, 1419, after a siege lasting 6 months, represented the culmination of Henry's systematic conquest of Normandy and established English control over the duchy's most important commercial and administrative centre. The prolonged resistance offered by Rouen's defenders, supported by the city's formidable fortifications and substantial civilian population, required the deployment of the full range of siege warfare techniques that English forces had perfected during their previous operations. The systematic blockade that prevented all supplies from reaching the city created conditions of severe hardship that ultimately forced surrender while demonstrating English capabilities for sustained siege operations against the strongest French defensive positions. The terms negotiated for Rouen's surrender reflected both medieval conventions regarding siege warfare and Henry V's broader objectives for establishing legitimate English authority over Norman territories. The preservation of civilian lives and property rights, contingent upon acknowledgement of English sovereignty, provided practical incentives for acceptance of the new political arrangements while avoiding the destruction that would have accompanied capture by storm. The systematic integration of Rouen's commercial and administrative infrastructure into English governmental systems created institutional continuity that facilitated the transition from French to English rule, while maintaining the economic activities that provided revenues for continued military operations. The assassination of John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, on September 10, 1419, during a meeting with the Dauphin Charles on the bridge at Montereau, fundamentally altered the political dynamics of the French Civil War and created unprecedented opportunities for English diplomatic and military advancement. The murder, carried out by supporters of the Dauphin in apparent retaliation for the Duke's assassination of Louis of Orleans 12 years earlier, transformed Burgundy from a potential French ally into an implacable enemy of the Armagnac faction that controlled the royal government. The shocking violation of safe conduct that had guaranteed the Duke's security during the meeting created scandal throughout European courts, while providing Henry V with powerful propaganda advantages in his efforts to present himself as the legitimate defender of French interests against an illegitimate and murderous regime. Philip the Good, who inherited the Burgundian duchy and the responsibility for avenging his father's murder, possessed both the military resources and political motivation necessary to transform the Anglo-Burgundian relationship from cautious cooperation into active alliance against the Dauphin's government. The new Duke's determination to secure justice for his father's assassination created common cause with English objectives that went far beyond the tactical cooperation that had characterized previous relationships between the two powers. The systematic coordination of military operations that emerged from this shared hostility toward the Armagnac faction created strategic opportunities that neither England nor Burgundy could have achieved independently. Henry's skillful exploitation of Burgundian desire for revenge demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of the psychological and political factors that motivated medieval noble behaviour. The king's immediate diplomatic response to John the Fearless's assassination, expressing horror at the violation of safe conduct while offering support for Burgundian efforts to secure justice, positioned England as the defender of legitimate noble rights against a regime that had demonstrated its willingness to employ treachery and murder as political weapons. The systematic propaganda campaign that presented the Dauphin as an illegitimate ruler whose crimes disqualified him from royal authority provided moral justification for English claims to the French throne, while appealing to European opinion that valued honour and legitimate governance. The military cooperation between English and Burgundian forces that developed throughout late 1419 and early 1420 created unprecedented pressure on the Armagnac faction, while demonstrating the practical benefits that systematic alliance could provide for both parties. The coordination of siege operations against Armagnac strongholds, with English forces providing artillery expertise, while Burgundian troops contributed local knowledge and additional manpower, achieved results that exceeded what either force could have accomplished independently. The systematic sharing of intelligence about Armagnac military preparations and diplomatic initiatives created tactical advantages that enabled Allied forces to anticipate and counter enemy operations while maintaining strategic initiative across multiple theatres of operation. The negotiations that led to the Treaty of Troyes began in earnest during the winter of 1419 to 1420, as the combined pressure of English military success and Burgundian political support created conditions that made comprehensive settlement both necessary and achievable for the first time since Henry V's accession to the throne. The French royal government, effectively controlled by Queen Isabeau of Bavaria following Charles VI's periodic lapses into madness, faced the practical reality that continued resistance to English claims would likely result in complete military defeat and the loss of territories that might still be preserved through negotiated settlement. The systematic exclusion of the Dauphin from succession arrangements, justified by his involvement in the Montereau assassination, provided legal cover for agreements that would have been impossible while he remained the recognised heir to the French throne. The complex legal and dynastic issues addressed by the Treaty of Troyes required extensive consultation with experts in canon law, civil law, and royal genealogy, who could provide authoritative guidance on the unprecedented arrangements being negotiated. The recognition of Henry VI as heir to the French throne, superseding the claims of the disinherited Dauphin, involved detailed examination of precedents regarding royal succession and the circumstances under which legitimate heirs could be excluded from inheritance. The systematic documentation of the Dauphin's crimes and their legal consequences provided justification for his disinheritance while establishing the framework for Henry's recognition as the rightful successor to Charles VI. The marriage arrangements that formed a crucial component of the Treaty of Troyes reflected both medieval diplomatic conventions regarding dynastic alliances and the specific political requirements created by the unprecedented nature of the settlement being negotiated. The betrothal of Henry V to Catherine of Valois, daughter of Charles VI, provided symbolic reinforcement for English claims to French royal authority, while creating family relationships that would legitimise the proposed succession arrangements. The detailed negotiations regarding Catherine's dowry, including territorial grants and financial provisions, demonstrated the practical considerations that complemented the ceremonial aspects of royal marriage while providing additional security for the implementation of treaty obligations. The territorial provisions of the Treaty of Troyes established Henry there as regent of France during Charles VI's lifetime, while confirming English possession of all conquered territories and recognising English claims to additional regions that remained under Armagnac control. The systematic delineation of territorial boundaries and administrative responsibilities created practical frameworks for the implementation of the dual monarchy that the treaty envisioned, while the detailed provisions regarding taxation, military service, and judicial authority addressed the complex governmental challenges that would arise from the union of the two crowns. The careful preservation of French legal traditions and administrative practices within the framework of English royal authority demonstrated Henry's recognition that successful governance required respect for established customs and institutions, even while implementing fundamental political changes. The formal signing of the Treaty of Troyes on May 21, 1420, at the Cathedral of St. Peter in Troyes, represented the culmination of Henry's diplomatic and military efforts since his accession to the English throne 7 years earlier. The elaborate ceremony, conducted in the presence of representatives from across Europe, provided powerful symbolic confirmation of the revolutionary changes in French royal succession, while establishing the legal foundations for the dual monarchy that would unite England and France under Lancastrian rule. The systematic exchange of oaths and guarantees between the contracting parties created binding obligations that transformed the theoretical claims Henry had inherited into practical arrangements for governmental authority that extended across both sides of the English Channel. The implementation of the Treaty of Troyes required immediate attention to the ceremonial and practical aspects of establishing the unprecedented dual monarchy that would unite the crowns of England and France under Henry's authority. The marriage between Henry and Catherine of Valois, celebrated at the Church of St. John the Baptist in Troyes on June 2, 1420, represented far more than a diplomatic alliance sealed through matrimonial bonds. The elaborate ceremony, conducted according to both French and English royal traditions, served as a public declaration of the legitimacy of Lancastrian claims to French sovereignty, while creating the dynastic foundation upon which the unified monarchy would rest. Catherine herself, at 19 years of age, possessed the refined education and courtly accomplishments expected of a French princess, having been tutored in Latin, music, and the complex ceremonial protocols that governed royal behaviour. Her fluency in both French and the rudimentary English she had acquired in preparation for her marriage facilitated communication with her new husband, while symbolising the linguistic and cultural bridge that the dual monarchy sought to establish between the two realms. The princess's documented piety and charitable inclinations aligned well with Henry's own religious devotion, creating personal compatibility that complemented the political necessities that had arranged their union. The wedding ceremony itself incorporated elements designed to emphasise the equal dignity of both crowns being united through the marriage. Henry appeared in cloth of gold robes that bore the heraldic arms of both England and France. While Catherine wore a gown of white silk embroidered with the fleur-de-lis of her native land and the lions of her adopted realm. The exchange of rings, blessed by both English and French ecclesiastical authorities, symbolised the spiritual dimension of the union, while the presence of nobles from both kingdoms provided witness to the political compact being solemnised through matrimonial sacrament. The honeymoon period that followed the royal wedding provided Henry with his first sustained opportunity to experience French court life and administrative practices from within the governmental structure, rather than as a conquering foreign ruler. The royal progress through territories controlled by the Anglo-Burgundian alliance allowed the new king-regent to observe first-hand the complex relationships between central authority and local governance that characterised French political traditions. The systematic meetings with municipal officials, ecclesiastical leaders, and regional nobles provided practical education in the diverse customs and expectations that would need to be accommodated within the framework of unified royal authority. The administrative challenges of governing two kingdoms simultaneously became apparent immediately following Henry's assumption of the regency, requiring the development of institutional mechanisms that could coordinate policy across the English Channel while maintaining effective control over territories that remained contested by Armagnac forces. The appointment of trusted regents to oversee English affairs during Henry's extended presence in France reflected his recognition that successful dual monarchy required delegation of authority to officials whose loyalty and competence could be relied upon absolutely. Thomas, Duke of Clarence, received primary responsibility for English military affairs, while Cardinal Henry Beaufort assumed oversight of financial and diplomatic matters that required coordination between the two realms. The integration of Norman and English governmental systems proceeded through careful adaptation of existing administrative structures, rather than wholesale replacement of French institutions with English alternatives. The preservation of the Norman exchequer at Caen, staffed by English officials but operating according to modified French procedures, provided continuity in tax collection and financial administration, while ensuring that revenues flowed to royal coffers rather than supporting continued Armagnac resistance. The systematic training of English clerks in French legal procedures and documentary practices created the administrative expertise necessary for effective governance while maintaining institutional knowledge that had developed over centuries of French rule. The establishment of English garrisons throughout Normandy required careful attention to the balance between military security and civilian acceptance that would determine the long-term viability of English rule. The strategic placement of fortified positions at key river crossings, road junctions and commercial centres created defensive networks capable of maintaining order while providing bases for offensive operations against remaining Armagnac strongholds. The systematic rotation of garrison commanders between different posts prevented the development of local loyalties that might compromise allegiance to English royal authority, while ensuring that military leaders gained experience in the diverse challenges of governing French territories. The continued military campaigns necessary to secure territories not controlled by the Anglo-Burgundian alliance demanded systematic coordination between English forces operating from Norman bases and Burgundian armies advancing from their eastern strongholds. The siege of Melun, which began in July 1420, exemplified the sophisticated joint operations that characterised this phase of the conquest. English artillery, transported along the Seine from Norman depots, provided the siege train necessary for effective bombardment of the town's walls, while Burgundian forces contributed local intelligence and additional manpower for the investment of the fortress. The resistance encountered at Melun revealed the continued strength of Armagnac military capabilities and the determination of Dauphinois supporters to contest English claims, despite the diplomatic revolution achieved through the Treaty of Troyes. The garrison commander, Arnaud Guillaume de Barbazan, possessed extensive experience in siege warfare and had prepared comprehensive defensive measures that included the systematic destruction of buildings outside the walls that might provide cover for attacking forces. the deployment of counter-artillery that targeted English siege positions demonstrated French adaptation to the new military technologies while prolonging resistance far beyond what earlier sieges had required. The systematic reduction of Dauphinois strongholds throughout 1420 and 1421 involved the development of specialised siege techniques adapted to the particular challenges posed by different types of fortifications. The assault on Montereau, site of John the Fearless's assassination, required extensive engineering works to overcome the town's position on elevated ground, surrounded by marshes that limited approaches for siege equipment. The construction of causeway bridges across the wetlands, built under constant harassment from the garrison's crossbowmen and early firearms, demonstrated the engineering capabilities that English forces had developed through their extensive siege experience in both Wales and Normandy. The capture of Meaux after a siege lasting 7 months represented perhaps the most significant military achievement of Henry's final campaigns, requiring the deployment of innovative siege techniques against one of the strongest fortified positions remaining under Dauphinois control. The town's location on an island in the Marne River created defensive advantages that traditional siege methods could not overcome, necessitating the construction of extensive bridgeworks and floating batteries that enabled English artillery to engage the fortress walls from multiple directions simultaneously. The systematic coordination of naval and land forces during the siege demonstrated tactical sophistication that reflected years of experience in combined arms operations. The birth of the future Henry VI on December 6, 1421 at Windsor Castle provided the dual monarchy with the dynastic continuity essential for long-term stability, while creating immediate concerns about succession planning given the dangerous nature of Henry's continued military campaigning. The infant prince's arrival generated celebrations throughout both England and the French territories under English control, with ceremonial proclamations that emphasised his inheritance of claims to both crowns through his father's conquest and his mother's royal blood. The systematic documentation of the prince's birth, witnessed by representatives from both realms, established the legal foundations for his eventual succession while providing propaganda advantages in the ongoing struggle against Dauphinoist opposition. Catherine's role as Queen Regent during Henry's military campaigns required her adaptation to English court customs and governmental procedures while maintaining her connections to French noble families whose support remained crucial for the dual monarchy's success. Her establishment of a household that included both English and French attendants created a cultural bridge between the two realms, while providing practical demonstration of the unified monarchy's commitment to respecting French traditions within the framework of English royal authority. The Queen's documented charitable activities, including substantial donations to religious institutions in both kingdoms, enhanced popular support for the Lancastrian dynasty, while fulfilling the religious obligations expected of medieval royalty. The administrative burden of coordinating governmental activities across the English Channel required the development of communication systems capable of maintaining regular contact between royal officials in England and France despite the challenges posed by weather, military operations, and potential enemy interference. The establishment of regular courier services, protected by naval escorts and utilising predetermined routes through secure territories, enabled the transmission of official documents, financial records, and strategic intelligence with unprecedented reliability. The systematic encryption of sensitive communications, using codes developed by royal clerks trained in both kingdoms, provided security against enemy interception while maintaining the confidentiality essential for effective governance. The financial integration of English and Norman revenues created opportunities for more efficient resource allocation, while requiring careful attention to the different monetary systems, taxation methods, and commercial practices that characterised the two realms. The standardisation of weights and measures used in cross-channel trade facilitated commercial relationships while providing practical benefits for merchants operating in both markets. The systematic coordination of customs policies, designed to encourage trade while generating revenues for continued military operations, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the economic foundations that sustained medieval governmental authority. The recruitment and training of administrative personnel capable of operating effectively in both English and French governmental systems required extensive educational programs that produced clerks, judges, and financial officials with the linguistic skills and cultural knowledge necessary for successful dual monarchy administration. The establishment of training centres at Cannes and Rouen, where English clerks learned French legal procedures while French officials adapted to English administrative methods, create institutional mechanisms for the systematic integration of the governmental personnel. The careful selection of candidates based on demonstrated loyalty to English royal authority rather than national origin provided practical evidence of the dual monarchy's commitment to merit-based advancement within unified administrative structures. The military reforms implemented during this period reflected lessons learned from the extensive siege warfare that had characterized the Norman conquest while incorporating tactical innovations that emerged from cooperation with Burgundian forces. The systematic standardization of artillery calibers and ammunition types facilitated logistical coordination while enabling more effective concentration of firepower during siege operations. The development of mobile siege equipment that could be rapidly transported between different operational theatres provided tactical flexibility that enhanced English military capabilities while reducing the time required for investment of enemy strongholds. The diplomatic initiatives necessary to maintain the coalition that supported the dual monarchy required constant attention to the complex relationships between various European powers, whose support remained essential for long-term success. The systematic cultivation of relationships with German princes whose territories bordered French regions under Armagnac control created additional pressure on Dauphinois forces while providing intelligence about enemy military preparations and diplomatic activities. The coordination of policies regarding papal recognition, commercial privileges and military cooperation demonstrated the sophisticated alliance management that sustained English strategic advantages despite the fundamental challenges posed by governing territories separated by the English Channel. The establishment of English legal institutions in conquered French territories proceeded through careful adaptation of existing judicial procedures rather than wholesale imposition of English common law practices that might have generated popular resistance. The creation of mixed tribunals staffed by both English and French judges provided continuity in legal proceedings while ensuring that royal authority was properly represented in judicial decisions. The systematic codification of legal procedures that incorporated elements from both legal traditions created institutional frameworks that balanced respect for local customs with the requirements of unified royal justice. The ongoing construction and fortification of strategic position throughout Normandy reflected Henry V's understanding that permanent territorial control required substantial investment in defensive infrastructure capable of withstanding future Armagnac attempts at reconquest. The systematic strengthening of existing fortifications through the addition of artillery positions, improved gateways, and expanded living quarters for enlarged garrisons created defensive networks that could maintain English control even during periods when field armies were committed to offensive operations elsewhere. The careful coordination of fortification projects with local construction capabilities and material resources demonstrated practical attention to the logistical requirements that sustained long-term military occupation. As 1422 began, Henry V had successfully established the institutional foundations for dual monarchy while maintaining military pressure on remaining Dauphinois strongholds that threatened the security of English territorial control. The systematic integration of governmental, military and ecclesiastical institutions had created unprecedented unity between England and substantial portions of France. Yet, The king's personal involvement in continued siege operations exposed him to the physical dangers and health risks that medieval warfare inevitably entailed for commanders who shared the hardships faced by their soldiers in the field. The Siege of Meaux, beginning in October 1421, would prove to be Henry V's most gruelling military undertaking and ultimately his last major campaign. The fortress town occupied a strategically critical position on the Marne River, approximately 40 miles east of Paris, serving as the primary stronghold of the Bastard of Vaurus and his band of routiers who had terrorised the surrounding countryside for years while maintaining defiant resistance to Anglo-Burgundian authority. The town's formidable natural defences, enhanced by extensive artificial fortifications, created what many contemporary observers considered an impregnable position that had withstood multiple previous attempts at capture by both French royal forces and Burgundian armies. The decision to invest Meaux reflected Henry's recognition that the consolidation of dual monarchy required the elimination of all significant Dauphinois strongholds capable of threatening the security of territories under English control. The Bastard of Vaurus had transformed his fortress into a base for systematic raiding operations that disrupted commerce along the Marne, while providing sanctuary for Armagnac forces retreating from other theatres of operation. The psychological impact of allowing such defiance to continue would have undermined English claims to effective sovereignty over the region surrounding Paris, potentially encouraging other centres of resistance to maintain their opposition despite the diplomatic revolution achieved through the Treaty of Troyes. The technical challenges posed by Meaux's defensive position required innovative approaches to siege warfare that pushed English military engineering capabilities to their absolute limits. The town occupied two distinct areas connected by a heavily fortified bridge: the main settlement on the south bank of the Marne, and a smaller but equally well-defended section known as the Market on an island in the river. The systematic investment of both positions demanded the construction of extensive bridge works and floating platforms that would enable English artillery to engage the fortress walls from multiple directions while preventing relief attempts by Dauphinois forces operating in the surrounding region. The English army that assembled for the siege included many of the most experienced commanders and siege specialists who had participated in the systematic conquest of Normandy, bringing with them years of accumulated expertise in the complex technical and logistical challenges that prolonged siege operations inevitably entailed. The Earl of Warwick commanded the artillery train, which included some of the largest cannons yet deployed by English forces, massive bronze and iron guns capable of hurling stone projectiles weighing several £100 against the strongest medieval fortifications. The systematic positioning of these weapons required extensive earthwork construction to create stable platforms while providing protection against counter-battery fire from the garrison's own artillery. The deployment of English forces around Meaux revealed the sophisticated understanding of siege warfare that Henry's commanders had developed through their extensive experience in Norman campaigns. The establishment of multiple camps connected by fortified lines prevented the garrison from conducting effective sorties while creating defensive positions that could withstand relief attempts by external Dauphinoist forces. The systematic construction of trenches, palisades and artillery emplacements transformed the siege lines into permanent fortifications that enabled English forces to maintain their investment despite the harsh winter weather that made outdoor military operations increasingly difficult. The financial strain imposed by the Meaux siege became apparent within the first months of the operation, as the costs of maintaining a substantial army in the field while conducting complex engineering works far exceeded the revenues generated by English-controlled territories in France. The systematic supply of artillery ammunition, siege equipment, and provisions for thousands of soldiers required constant shipments from Norman depots and English supply bases, creating logistical demands that strained the dual monarchy's financial resources to their breaking point. the careful accounting records maintained by royal clerks reveal expenditures that consume the equivalent of several years' normal royal revenues within the span of a few months, highlighting the enormous costs associated with maintaining territorial conquests through continuous military pressure. The prolonged nature of the siege created unprecedented challenges for maintaining army morale and discipline during the harsh winter months of 1421 to 1422. The English camps, constructed hastily in the autumn mud surrounding Meaux, provided inadequate shelter against the bitter cold and constant dampness that characterized the region's winter climate. The systematic rotation of troops between forward positions and rear areas helped maintain combat effectiveness while providing opportunities for rest and recuperation. Yet the grinding nature of siege warfare inevitably took its toll on soldiers who had already endured years of continuous campaigning in hostile territory. Henry's personal involvement in the siege operations demonstrated the hands-on leadership style that had characterized his entire military career, while exposing him to the same harsh conditions and health risks faced by common soldiers in the siege lines. The king's regular presence in forward artillery positions during bombardment operations provided powerful evidence of his commitment to sharing the dangers faced by his troops. Yet this exposure to the elements during the worst winter weather in recent memory began to take a visible toll on his physical condition. Contemporary chroniclers noted the king's increasingly gaunt appearance and persistent cough that developed during the winter months, symptoms that would prove to be early indicators of the illness that would ultimately claim his life. The resistance offered by the bastard of Varus and his garrison exceeded all expectations, revealing the determination and military competence that had enabled this stronghold to maintain its independence despite years of pressure from superior forces. The systematic repair of breaches created by English artillery bombardment required constant vigilance and enormous expenditure of materials and manpower, yet the garrison's engineers demonstrated remarkable skill in adapting their defences to counter English siege techniques. The deployment of counter-artillery that targeted English siege positions with increasing accuracy forced repeated relocation of guns and equipment, prolonging the siege while increasing its costs in both material resources and human casualties. The development of innovative siege techniques during the Meaux operation reflected the continuous evolution of military technology and tactics that characterized early 15th century European warfare. The construction of floating artillery platforms that could be manoeuvred along the Marne to engage different sections of the fortress walls represented a significant advancement in amphibious siege warfare, requiring coordination between naval and land forces that demonstrated the tactical sophistication English commanders had achieved through years of combined operations. The systematic use of incendiary projectiles designed to ignite buildings within the fortress created new categories of psychological pressure on the defenders, while providing practical means of disrupting their defensive preparations. The impact of prolonged siege warfare on the broader strategic situation became increasingly apparent as the months passed without decisive resolution at Meaux. The concentration of English military resources at a single fortress prevented the deployment of forces to other theatres, where Dauphinoist resistance continued to threaten the security of English territorial control. The systematic withdrawal of garrisons from less critical positions to reinforce the Meaux siege created vulnerabilities that enemy forces began to exploit, launching raids against isolated English outposts while avoiding direct confrontation with the main army committed to siege operations. The growing financial crisis facing the dual monarchy reflected the fundamental contradiction between the enormous costs of maintaining territorial conquests and the limited revenues that could be extracted from territories devastated by years of warfare. The systematic taxation of English-controlled regions in France generated substantial sums, yet these amounts proved insufficient to cover the expenses associated with continuous military operations, while simultaneously maintaining the governmental structures necessary for effective administration. The increasingly desperate appeals to Parliament for additional subsidies revealed the extent to which English financial resources had been stretched beyond their sustainable limits by the ambitious scope of Henry's continental campaigns. The health crisis that began to affect Henry V during the winter months of the Meuse siege reflected both the physical demands of personal leadership in harsh campaign conditions and the psychological stress associated with managing the complex military and political challenges facing the dual monarchy. The king's persistent respiratory ailment, initially dismissed as a temporary consequence of exposure to winter weather, gradually developed into a more serious condition that limited his ability to maintain the active personal involvement in military operations that had characterized his leadership style. The increasing delegation of tactical responsibilities to subordinate commanders while maintaining strategic oversight of siege operations represented a significant departure from Henry's previous practice of direct personal command. The appointment of Thomas Montague, Earl of Salisbury, as field commander for day-to-day siege operations reflected Henry's recognition that his declining health required greater reliance on trusted subordinates while maintaining overall strategic control of the campaign. Salisbury's extensive experience in siege warfare, gained during the systematic conquest of Normandy, provided the technical expertise necessary for managing the complex engineering and tactical challenges that the Meaux operation continued to present. The systematic coordination between royal strategic direction and field tactical implementation created command structures that maintained operational effectiveness despite the king's reduced physical involvement in routine military activities. The evolution of English siege tactics during the Meaux operation incorporated lessons learned from previous campaigns while adapting to the specific challenges posed by the fortress's unique defensive position. The systematic coordination of artillery bombardment with infantry assault operations required precise timing and communication that demonstrated the professional military capabilities English forces had developed through years of siege warfare experience. The deployment of specialized assault troops equipped with scaling ladders, grappling hooks and portable bridges created tactical flexibility that enabled exploitation of breaches created by artillery fire while maintaining pressure on multiple sections of the fortress perimeter simultaneously. The psychological warfare employed during the siege reflected sophisticated understanding of the factors that influenced garrison morale and civilian support for continued resistance. The systematic display of captured Dauphinois banners and the public execution of prisoners taken in skirmishes created visible evidence of English military superiority, while demonstrating the consequences of continued opposition to legitimate royal authority. The careful coordination of propaganda activities with military operations enhanced the psychological pressure on the defenders while providing practical reinforcement for English claims to sovereignty over the disputed territories. The logistical innovations developed during the Meuse siege established precedents for supply chain management that would influence English military operations for decades to come. The systematic organisation of supply convoys protected by mobile escort forces created reliable transportation networks that maintained adequate provisions for siege operations despite enemy attempts at interdiction. The establishment of forward supply depots at strategic locations along the Marne provided intermediate storage facilities that reduced the vulnerability of supply lines while enabling more efficient distribution of materials to forward positions. The diplomatic implications of the prolonged siege began to affect broader European political relationships, as the enormous costs and extended duration of the operation raised questions about the sustainability of English territorial ambitions in France. The systematic monitoring of international opinion through diplomatic channels revealed growing concern among potential allies about the financial and military resources being consumed by what appeared to be an increasingly futile siege operation. The careful management of diplomatic communications to maintain confidence in English military capabilities while acknowledging the challenges posed by determined resistance required delicate balancing of competing political considerations. The eventual capture of the market section of Meaux in May 1422 provided the breakthrough that enabled systematic reduction of the main fortress, while demonstrating the effectiveness of the innovative siege techniques that English forces had developed during the prolonged operation. The systematic exploitation of the tactical advantages gained through control of the river island created opportunities for more effective artillery deployment against the remaining defensive positions, while cutting off supply lines that had enabled the garrison to maintain its resistance. The coordination of assault operations from multiple directions simultaneously overwhelmed the defenders' ability to respond effectively while minimizing casualties among English forces. The final surrender of Meaux on May 10, 1422, after 7 months of continuous siege operations, represented both a significant military achievement and a Pyrrhic victory that had consumed resources and manpower far beyond what the strategic value of the position could justify. The systematic documentation of siege costs revealed expenditures that exceeded the total revenues generated by several English counties, highlighting the unsustainable nature of the military commitments necessary to maintain territorial control over hostile French populations. The capture of the Bastard of Valrus and his principal lieutenants eliminated a significant source of Dauphinois resistance, while providing propaganda advantages that partially offset the enormous costs of the siege operation. The deterioration of Henry V's health accelerated dramatically following the successful conclusion of the Meaux siege, as the physical and psychological demands of the prolonged campaign had exhausted his remaining strength while exposing him to the dysentery and other diseases that flourished in medieval military camps. The king's increasing inability to maintain active personal involvement in military operations required systematic delegation of responsibilities to trusted commanders whose loyalty and competence had been proven through years of service in the Norman campaigns. The careful selection of regents and military commanders to oversee different aspects of dual monarchy administration reflected Henry's understanding that effective governance required institutional structures capable of functioning independently of personal royal involvement. The strategic situation at the time of Henry's final illness revealed both the remarkable achievements of his continental campaigns and the precarious nature of the territorial control that had been established through years of systematic military pressure. The English position in Normandy remained secure through the network of fortified strongholds and loyal garrisons that controlled all major river crossings and commercial centres. Yet the broader French territories claimed by the dual monarchy continued to face persistent Dauphinois resistance that required constant military attention. The systematic assessment of territorial control conducted by royal administrators revealed the enormous ongoing costs associated with maintaining English authority over populations that remained fundamentally hostile to foreign rule despite years of military occupation and administrative integration. The final weeks of Henry's life unfolded against the backdrop of military triumph, shadowed by physical decline that had accelerated dramatically following the grueling Meaux campaign. By late July 1422, the king's condition had deteriorated to the point where even his closest advisers could no longer ignore the severity of his illness. The dysentery that had initially appeared as a manageable consequence of siege warfare conditions had developed into a systemic infection that medieval medicine proved powerless to combat. Contemporary accounts describe Henry's gaunt appearance, his skin taking on the waxy pallor characteristic of advanced illness, while his once commanding voice had been reduced to barely audible whispers that required courtiers to lean close to discern his words. The royal party's journey from the recently captured Meaux to the Château de Vincennes in late August reflected Henry's recognition that his condition required the security and medical resources available only at a major royal residence. The château, located just outside Paris, had served French royalty for centuries as both a fortress and a palace, its massive keep rising 170 feet above the surrounding countryside, while its extensive courtyards provided space for the substantial household that accompanied medieval kings even in their final illness. The systematic transfer of governmental documents, financial records, and military correspondence to Vincennes demonstrated Henry's continued attention to administrative responsibilities even as his physical strength ebbed away. The king's chamber within the chateau's keep had been prepared with the religious artifacts and ceremonial objects appropriate for a medieval monarch's deathbed, including relics of saints whose intercession might provide spiritual comfort during his final hours. The room's tall windows, fitted with expensive glass that filtered the harsh August sunlight, looked out over the forests that had provided hunting grounds for French kings since the 12th century. Tapestries depicting biblical scenes and royal heraldry covered the stone walls, while a portable altar had been established near the bed to enable the celebration of Mass within the royal presence even when Henry's condition prevented movement to the chateau's chapel. The medical attention provided to the dying king represented the finest therapeutic knowledge available in early 15th century Europe, yet the treatments employed revealed the fundamental limitations of medieval understanding regarding infectious diseases. Royal physicians, summoned from both England and France, prescribed combinations of herbal remedies, bloodletting, and dietary restrictions that contemporary medical theory suggested might restore the balance of bodily humours believed to govern human health. The systematic documentation of treatments and their effects, maintained by court clerks who recorded every detail of the royal illness, provides modern historians with detailed insight into both medieval medical practices and the specific progression of Henry's final disease. The political implications of Henry's deteriorating condition created immediate concerns about succession arrangements and the continuity of governmental authority across the dual monarchy he had established. The infant Henry VI, born less than 9 months earlier, represented the dynastic future of both English and French crowns, yet his minority would require extensive regency arrangements that needed to be established before the king's death to prevent potential disputes over governmental authority. The systematic preparation of legal documents defining regency powers and territorial responsibilities occupied much of Henry's remaining energy as he struggled to ensure the survival of his political achievements beyond his own lifetime. The deathbed instructions that Henry V provided to his assembled councillors during his final days revealed both his strategic understanding of the challenges facing the dual monarchy and his determination to preserve Lancastrian authority through carefully planned institutional arrangements. The appointment of his brother John, Duke of Bedford, as Regent of France reflected Henry's confidence in Bedford's military capabilities and administrative experience, while the designation of Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, as Protector of England acknowledged the different challenges that would face royal authority on either side of the English Channel. The systematic delineation of powers and responsibilities between these regencies demonstrated Henry's recognition that effective governance during his son's minority would require clear institutional frameworks that prevented conflicts between competing centres of authority. The king's specific instructions regarding military policy revealed his understanding that the territorial conquests achieved through years of systematic warfare could only be maintained through continued military pressure on Dauphinoist resistance. The detailed memoranda prepared for Bedford's guidance included strategic assessments of French military capabilities, recommendations for garrison deployments, and financial projections that outlined the resources necessary to maintain English territorial control. The systematic organisation of military commands, with specific appointments for fortress captains and regional commanders, created institutional continuity that would enable the prosecution of military objectives even during the political uncertainties inherent in a minority reign. The financial arrangements established through Henry's final instructions addressed the chronic fiscal problems that had plagued the dual monarchy throughout its brief existence, while attempting to provide sustainable funding for continued military operations. The systematic allocation of revenues between English and French territories, with specific provisions for garrison maintenance and administrative costs, reflected detailed understanding of the economic foundations that sustained royal authority. The careful designation of financial officials responsible for different aspects of revenue collection and expenditure created administrative structures designed to prevent the corruption and mismanagement that might compromise the monarchy's fiscal position during the uncertainties of regency government. The religious provisions included in Henry's deathbed arrangements reflected both his personal piety and his understanding of the spiritual obligations that medieval kingship entailed. The systematic endowment of religious institutions, including provisions for masses to be celebrated for the repose of his soul, demonstrated the conventional expressions of royal devotion while providing practical support for ecclesiastical establishments that had supported Lancastrian political objectives. The specific instructions regarding charitable distributions and religious ceremonies created institutional mechanisms for maintaining the spiritual legitimacy that complemented the political and military foundations of royal authority. The diplomatic instructions prepared for the regency governments revealed Henry's sophisticated understanding of the international relationships that sustained English strategic advantages while highlighting potential threats that might emerge during the vulnerable period of minority rule. The systematic coordination of policies toward Burgundy, the Holy Roman Empire, and various German princes created frameworks for maintaining the alliance systems that had enabled English success in France. The detailed guidance regarding papal relations, commercial agreements, and military cooperation provided practical foundations for diplomatic continuity that would prove essential for preserving English strategic position during the coming years of political uncertainty. Henry V died at the Château de Vincennes in the early morning hours of August 31st, 1422, surrounded by the ecclesiastical and secular officials whose presence provided both spiritual comfort and political witness to the end of one of medieval England's most remarkable reigns. The king's final moments, according to contemporary accounts, were marked by expressions of concern for his infant son's future and prayers for the preservation of the territorial conquests that had defined his adult life. His last audible words, reportedly expressing confidence in divine providence and hope for his son's successful reign, provided the assembled courtiers with final evidence of the piety and determination that had characterized his approach to royal responsibilities. The immediate aftermath of Henry's death required careful coordination between English and French officials to ensure the smooth transition of authority while preventing potential challenges to the legitimacy of the infant Henry VI's succession. The systematic proclamation of the new king's accession, conducted simultaneously in Westminster and Paris, demonstrated the institutional mechanisms that had been established to maintain governmental continuity across the dual monarchy. The careful preservation of Henry's body, prepared for the elaborate funeral ceremonies that medieval royal protocol required, provided time for the complex arrangements necessary to transport the deceased king from France to his final resting place at Westminster Abbey. The regency arrangements that took effect immediately upon Henry's death reflected the detailed planning that had characterised his final weeks, with Bedford assuming control of French territories while Gloucester took responsibility for English governmental affairs. The systematic division of military resources between the two regencies, including the allocation of experienced commanders and financial resources, created operational frameworks designed to maintain pressure on Dauphinois resistance while preserving domestic stability in England. The coordination of policies between the regencies, facilitated by regular communication across the English Channel, demonstrated institutional sophistication that enabled effective governance despite the physical separation of governmental centres. The news of Henry's death created immediate strategic opportunities for Dauphinois forces that had been contained but never eliminated during the years of English territorial expansion. Charles VII, the disinherited Dauphin who had maintained his claims to French royal authority despite the Treaty of Troyes, recognised that the minority of Henry VI created political vulnerabilities that might be exploited through coordinated military and diplomatic initiatives. The systematic mobilisation of Armagnac military resources, supported by renewed diplomatic efforts to secure Scottish and other foreign assistance, demonstrated the persistent nature of French resistance to English territorial control. The elaborate funeral procession that carried Henry's body from Vincennes to Westminster Abbey provided powerful symbolic reinforcement for Lancastrian dynastic claims, while demonstrating the international recognition that English military achievements had earned. The cortege, accompanied by representatives from across Europe, proceeded through territories that bore witness to English military success, while providing visible evidence of the respect that Henry's achievements had commanded among contemporary rulers. The systematic organisation of funeral ceremonies, conducted according to both English and French royal traditions, emphasised the dual monarchy's legitimacy, while providing ceremonial continuity that reinforced political stability during the uncertain early months of the new reign. The lying in state at Westminster Abbey attracted thousands of mourners whose presence demonstrated the popular support that Henry V had achieved through his military successes and domestic policies. The elaborate catafalque, surrounded by burning candles and decorated with the royal arms of both England and France, provided a focal point for expressions of grief that transcended normal social boundaries as nobles and commoners alike paid their respects to the deceased king. The systematic organisation of public access to the royal remains, carefully managed to prevent disorder while enabling widespread participation in funeral observances, revealed a sophisticated understanding of public ceremony that characterised Lancastrian approaches to royal legitimacy. The funeral service itself, conducted by the Archbishop of Canterbury in the presence of virtually the entire English nobility, provided both religious solemnity and political demonstration of continued support for the Lancastrian dynasty. The elaborate liturgical ceremonies, enhanced by musical performances that showcased the finest ecclesiastical talent available, created emotional and spiritual experiences that reinforced the sacred nature of royal authority, while providing comfort to mourners grieving the loss of their warrior king. The systematic coordination of ceremonial elements, from the procession of royal regalia to the final committal prayers, demonstrated institutional capabilities that would prove essential for maintaining governmental stability during the challenging years ahead. The immediate diplomatic consequences of Henry's death became apparent as European powers began reassessing their relationships with England in light of the changed circumstances created by minority rule. The systematic monitoring of international reactions, conducted through diplomatic networks that Henry had established throughout his reign, revealed both continuing support for English strategic objectives and emerging opportunities for enemies to exploit perceived weaknesses in the Regency arrangements. The careful management of diplomatic communications, designed to project confidence in governmental continuity while acknowledging the challenges posed by the king's death, required sophisticated coordination between English and French administrative centres. The military situation facing the Regency governments reflected both the substantial territorial gains achieved during Henry's reign and the continuing challenges posed by Dauphinoist resistance that had never been completely eliminated. The systematic assessment of garrison strengths, conducted immediately following Henry's death, revealed the enormous military commitments necessary to maintain English territorial control, while highlighting potential vulnerabilities that enemy forces might exploit. The careful reallocation of military resources, designed to maintain defensive capabilities while preserving options for offensive operations, demonstrated strategic planning that reflected lessons learned during years of continental warfare. The financial implications of Henry's death extended far beyond the immediate costs of funeral ceremonies to encompass the broader fiscal challenges facing a dual monarchy that had been sustained primarily through the personal authority and military success of its founder. The systematic review of governmental revenues and expenditures, conducted by financial officials in both England and France, revealed the precarious nature of the economic foundations that supported continued territorial control. The careful coordination of taxation policies and military expenditures, designed to maintain adequate funding for essential governmental functions while avoiding the popular resistance that excessive taxation might provoke, required delicate balancing of competing priorities that would test the administrative capabilities of the Regency governments. The succession of the 9-month-old Henry VI created unprecedented challenges for maintaining royal authority across territories that had been unified primarily through the personal charisma and military achievements of his father. The systematic establishment of governmental procedures adapted to the requirements of minority rule, including modified ceremonial protocols and altered decision-making processes, demonstrated institutional flexibility that would prove essential for preserving Lancastrian political control. The careful coordination of policies between regency councils, military commanders, and administrative officials created frameworks for governmental continuity that transcended the immediate crisis created by Henry V's premature death, while establishing foundations for the long-term preservation of his territorial and political achievements. The immediate chroniclers who documented Henry V's reign wrote within the shadow of his extraordinary achievements, their accounts shaped by the dramatic nature of his military victories and the unprecedented scope of his territorial conquests. Thomas Walsingham, writing at St. Albans Abbey during Henry's lifetime, portrayed the king as a divinely blessed warrior, whose victories at Harfleur and Agincourt demonstrated God's favour toward English claims to French sovereignty. Walsingham's chronicle emphasises Henry's personal piety, his careful attention to military discipline, and his systematic approach to siege warfare, presenting these qualities as evidence of royal virtue that justified both his domestic authority and his continental ambitions. The chronicler's detailed descriptions of the Agincourt campaign, based on eyewitness accounts from participants, established many of the narrative elements that would dominate subsequent historical interpretations for centuries. The anonymous author of the Gesta Henrici Quinti, writing shortly after the king's death, provided perhaps the most influential contemporary assessment of Henry's achievements and character. This Latin chronicle, composed by someone with intimate knowledge of royal court proceedings and military operations, presents Henry as the ideal Christian king whose victories resulted from divine intervention, rewarding his moral rectitude and strategic wisdom. The Gesta's account of Agincourt, with its emphasis on the miraculous nature of English victory against overwhelming odds, established interpretive frameworks that portrayed Henry's military success as evidence of providential support for English claims to French sovereignty. The chronicler's systematic documentation of diplomatic negotiations, siege operations, and administrative reforms provides detailed evidence of Henry's governmental capabilities while maintaining the reverential tone appropriate for commemorating a deceased monarch whose achievements had transformed European political relationships. French chroniclers of the period faced the complex challenge of explaining their nation's military disasters while maintaining some semblance of national dignity in their historical accounts. Enguerrand de Monstrelet, writing from his Burgundian perspective, acknowledged English military superiority while attributing French defeats to internal divisions rather than fundamental weaknesses in French military capabilities. Monstrelet's chronicle emphasises the role of civil war in undermining French resistance to English conquest, presenting the Armagnac-Burgundian conflict as the primary factor that enabled Henry's territorial gains. His detailed accounts of siege operations and battlefield tactics provide valuable insights into military developments, while revealing French recognition of English innovations in artillery deployment and combined arms coordination. The Chronique du Religieux de Saint-Denis, composed at the abbey that served as the traditional burial place of French kings, reflects the profound shock that Henry's conquests created within French ecclesiastical and intellectual circles. The chronicler's account of the Treaty of Troyes reveals deep ambivalence about the diplomatic revolution that had placed a foreign king in line to inherit the French crown, while his descriptions of English administrative practices in conquered territories demonstrate grudging respect for the efficiency of Lancastrian governmental systems. The chronicle's emphasis on the temporary nature of English success, with frequent references to divine justice eventually restoring French sovereignty, reflects the psychological necessity of maintaining hope for national recovery, despite the overwhelming evidence of English military and political dominance. The evolution of Henry V's historical reputation during the later medieval period reflected changing political circumstances and the gradual development of more sophisticated historical analysis. The chronicles of the 15th and early 16th centuries, written during the final phases of the 100 Years' War and its immediate aftermath, began to assess Henry's achievements within broader contexts that considered long-term consequences as well as immediate military success. Jean de Wavrin's chronicle, completed in the 1470s, provides a more balanced assessment that acknowledges both English military excellence and the ultimate failure of the dual monarchy to achieve permanent integration of French territories under English rule. The Tudor appropriation of Henry's legacy served specific political purposes related to establishing the legitimacy of a dynasty that had gained the throne through military conquest, rather than clear hereditary right. Henry VII's systematic promotion of Henry V as a model warrior king provided historical precedent for successful usurpation, while demonstrating the potential rewards of aggressive foreign policy pursued with adequate military resources and strategic planning. The elaborate tomb erected for Henry V at Westminster Abbey during the early Tudor period, with its silver-gilt effigy and surrounding chantry chapel, created a physical monument to royal military achievement that reinforced dynastic propaganda about the glorious traditions of English kingship. Tudor historians like Polydore Virgil and Edward Hall developed increasingly sophisticated interpretations of Henry V's reign that emphasized the systematic nature of his strategic planning and the professional competence of his military and administrative appointments. These accounts, written with access to governmental records that provided detailed insights into royal decision-making processes, portrayed Henry as a calculating political leader whose apparent impulsiveness masked careful preparation and strategic foresight. The systematic documentation of financial arrangements, diplomatic negotiations, and military preparations revealed the extent of institutional development that had enabled English success while providing practical lessons for contemporary rulers facing similar challenges in maintaining royal authority through military achievement. The emergence of William Shakespeare's Henry V trilogy in the 1590s fundamentally transformed popular understanding of the historical king, while creating literary interpretations that would dominate cultural memory for centuries. Shakespeare's dramatic portrayal drew selectively from chronicle sources, emphasizing elements that served theatrical purposes while creating character developments that reflected Elizabethan rather than medieval political concerns. The playwright's famous depiction of Prince Hal's transformation from dissolute youth to heroic king provided compelling dramatic narrative, while establishing interpretive frameworks that emphasized personal redemption and moral development over the systematic political and military planning that actually characterized Henry's approach to kingship. Shakespeare's Agincourt speeches, particularly the St. Crispin's Day oration, created rhetorical masterpieces that captured popular imagination while fundamentally distorting historical understanding of medieval military leadership and the social relationships that characterized 15th century English armies. The playwright's emphasis on egalitarian fellowship between king and common soldiers reflected Renaissance humanist ideals rather than medieval hierarchical structures, while his portrayal of French opponents as effete and incompetent ignored the military competence that had enabled prolonged resistance to English conquest. The dramatic power of Shakespeare's interpretation, enhanced by memorable poetry and compelling character development, established cultural narratives about Henry V that proved far more influential than scholarly historical analysis in shaping popular understanding of the medieval king. The impact of Shakespeare's interpretation extended far beyond English literary culture, influencing European understanding of medieval English history, while providing political metaphors that would be employed by later generations facing military and diplomatic challenges. The playwright's emphasis on English national unity achieved through foreign conquest provided ideological frameworks that would be adapted to serve various political purposes, from Cromwellian republicanism to Victorian imperialism to 20th century wartime propaganda. The systematic transformation of complex medieval political relationships into simplified dramatic narratives created historical mythology that obscured the actual circumstances of Henry's reign while providing emotionally satisfying explanations for English military success. The development of professional historical scholarship during the 18th and 19th centuries began the slow process of distinguishing between literary legend and documented historical reality in assessments of Henry V's reign. Historians like David Hume and William Stubbs, working with expanded access to governmental records and chronicle sources, developed more nuanced interpretations that acknowledge both Henry's remarkable achievements and the limitations that medieval circumstances imposed on royal authority. These scholarly assessments emphasised the systematic nature of Henry's military and administrative reforms, while questioning the long-term sustainability of the territorial conquests that had defined his reign. Victorian historians, influenced by contemporary imperial experiences, developed interpretations of Henry V that emphasised his role as a state builder, whose institutional innovations transcended immediate military achievements. Historians like James Henry Ramsay and Charles Lethbridge Kingsford portrayed Henry as a modernising monarch whose administrative reforms and military innovations anticipated developments that would characterise early modern European statecraft. These interpretations, while acknowledging the ultimate failure of the dual monarchy, emphasised Henry's contributions to governmental efficiency and military professionalism as lasting achievements that influenced subsequent English political development. The emergence of professional medieval studies during the early 20th century brought unprecedented scholarly attention to the documentary evidence surrounding Henry V's reign, enabling more sophisticated analysis of his achievements within their proper historical contexts. Historians like R.B. Mowat and E.F. Jacob, working with systematic examination of chancery rolls, financial records, and diplomatic correspondence, developed interpretations that emphasised the practical challenges Henry faced in attempting to govern territories separated by the English Channel, while maintaining military pressure on persistent French resistance. These scholarly assessments revealed the enormous financial costs associated with Henry's territorial ambitions, while documenting the administrative innovations that had enabled temporary success in managing dual monarchy. The reassessment of Henry's legacy accelerated during the later 20th century as historians developed more sophisticated understanding of medieval military, political, and social structures. Scholars like K.B. Macfarlane and Christopher Almond, employing methodological approaches that emphasize social and economic factors alongside traditional political narrative, reveal the complex relationships between royal authority, noble loyalty, and popular support that had sustained English territorial control in France. These interpretations acknowledged Henry's remarkable personal achievements, while questioning whether the dual monarchy represented sustainable political development or merely temporary conquest dependent on continued military success. Modern historical debate over Henry's legacy reflects broader scholarly discussions about the nature of medieval kingship, the role of warfare in political development, and the relationship between personal leadership and institutional innovation. Historians like Anne Curry and Malcolm Vail have emphasised the professional military capabilities that enabled English success, while acknowledging the fundamental weaknesses that ultimately doomed the dual monarchy to failure. Their systematic analysis of military records, financial accounts, and administrative documents reveals both the scope of Henry's achievements and the inherent limitations that medieval technology and political structures imposed on attempts to maintain permanent territorial control over hostile populations. Contemporary scholarly assessment of Henry V increasingly emphasises the tragic dimensions of his reign, acknowledging his remarkable personal capabilities while recognising that his ambitious continental policy ultimately weakened rather than strengthened English strategic position. The enormous financial costs of maintaining territorial control in France, combined with the military commitments necessary to suppress persistent French resistance, create unsustainable burdens that compromised English domestic stability while failing to achieve permanent political integration between the two realms. The systematic documentation of these costs, revealed through detailed analysis of governmental financial records, demonstrates that Henry's military success came at prices that medieval English resources could not sustain indefinitely. The modern understanding of Henry's historical significance emphasises his role as both the culmination of medieval English military achievement and the beginning of the strategic overextension that would characterise English continental policy for the remainder of the 15th century. His systematic innovations in siege warfare, military administration, and diplomatic coordination established precedents that influenced European military development for generations, while his territorial conquests created strategic commitments that exceeded English capabilities to maintain through purely military means. The ultimate failure of the dual monarchy, achieved within a generation of Henry's death, demonstrates the limitations of personal charismatic leadership in creating sustainable political institutions capable of transcending the circumstances of their foundation. The enduring fascination with Henry V reflects both his genuine historical achievements and the powerful literary and cultural narratives that have shaped popular understanding of his reign. His transformation from a relatively obscure medieval king into a cultural icon represents one of the most successful examples of historical mythology, demonstrating how literary interpretation can fundamentally alter collective memory of past events. Yet beneath the layers of literary embellishment and political appropriation lies the historical reality of a remarkably capable ruler, whose brief reign fundamentally altered European political relationships, while establishing precedents for military and governmental innovation that transcended the immediate circumstances of his continental campaigns. The assessment of Henry V's ultimate historical significance must balance recognition of his extraordinary personal achievements against acknowledgement of the long-term consequences that his policies created for both English and French political development. His military victories demonstrated the potential for systematic strategic planning and professional military organisation to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, while his administrative innovations revealed possibilities for governmental efficiency that transcended traditional medieval limitations. Yet the ultimate collapse of his territorial conquests within 30 years of his death illustrates the fundamental challenges that medieval political structures faced in attempting to create lasting unity between populations separated by language, culture, and centuries of independent political development. Henry V remains, therefore, a figure whose historical importance lies not merely in his military achievements, but in his representation of both the possibilities and limitations that characterized medieval royal authority at its most effective. His reign demonstrated what exceptional personal leadership could accomplish within medieval political and military frameworks, while simultaneously revealing the inherent constraints that prevented even the most successful medieval conquests from achieving permanent political integration. The enduring debate over his legacy reflects continuing scholarly and popular fascination with the complex relationships between individual achievement and historical circumstance. between military success and political sustainability, and between the dramatic narratives that capture popular imagination and the documentary evidence that reveals the more complex realities of medieval political life.